Emer, the daughter of Forgal, the tricky and wife of Cú Chulainn, once declared, "I am the measure of womanhood, in body, in elegance, and in wisdom. None equals my beauty, for I am the image of all graces. My bearing is noble, my gaze shines like a jewel. In form, in grace, in beauty, in wisdom, in generosity and purity, none compare with me. The joy of love and desire has never found a likeness to mine. Ulster sighs for me, for I am the very nut of the heart. My husband is the hound of Culan, no weakling, but a warrior whose spear spurts blood and whose sword drips life. His form is finely shaped, though torn with wounds, and still his proud eye looks westward. His chariot gleams with red, its frame and cushions dyed in blood. From the manes of horses to the breath of warriors, battle surges about him. He springs like a salmon, soaring with the leap of heroes, performing feats rare and bird-like, vaulting pools as if 9 men together. He scatters armies, cuts down kings in fury, and mows the ranks of foes. With this speech, she triumphed in the Women's War of Words at the Feast of Bricriu, an Irish tale from the Middle Ages. Her rank was exalted, for she was the wife of Cú Chulainn, greatest hero of the Ulster cycle. The contest was one of eloquence, as the wives of warriors boasted of their own beauty and the deeds of their husbands. Emer outshone them all with her flowing words. In this glimpse of early Irish story, we see Celts much as ancient Greek and Roman writers described them. Bold, boastful, feasting, and lovers of poetry, wisdom, and beauty. The Romans left their richest commentary on the Gauls, but here we see a parallel image of the Irish. No single stereotype can capture a people, yet the voices of poets and wives reveal the values of their elite, for whom songs and genealogies were performed. The legions brought literacy into many Celtic lands, though at the cost of language, for Celtic speech gave way to Latin within the empire. The Celts of continental Europe left no lasting literature in their own tongues, only fragments like inscriptions and curse tablets. True narratives survive only from those whose speech was not overwhelmed by Rome. Ireland remained outside the empire, and the Roman province of Britain lay only at its fringe. Thus, Celtic languages endured in the islands, where tales in Gaelic and poems in Brittonic were preserved. Among these is the collection known as Y Gododin, a series of death songs from northern Britain, later recorded in Wales. One elegy recalls a lord of Dumbarton. He rose early when the soldiers gathered, moving from post to post. At the head of 100 men, he was first to strike. His hunger for corpses was as great as his thirst for mead or wine. With bitter hatred, the laughing fighter of Dumbarton slew his enemies. Here again, courage is celebrated. Leaders were expected to charge at the front, not direct from behind. This laughing fighter inspired his followers by the joy he took in battle. These verses echo the tribal world the Romans had once encountered among the Celts. The Gododin, whose name reflects the earlier Votadini, lived between the Firth of Forth and the River Wear. Today, their lands lie in northeast England and southeast Scotland. One of their strongholds lay beneath modern Edinburgh Castle, known then as Iden, where a war band feasted before the great battle sung in Y Gododin. Chiefs who lavished meat and mead upon their men expected loyalty repaid in feats of courage. As one verse proclaimed, "The trees of battle were trampled, vengeance in payment for mead." Warriors came not only from the Gododin, but from neighboring realms. The Lord of Dumbarton himself joined from Alt Clud, with its fortress overlooking the Clyde. The Lord of Iden was the son of a man with the English name Wulston. while his enemies were the Angles of Deira in what is now Yorkshire. This hostility reflected the struggles of the Angles and Saxons who poured into Britain after Rome's withdrawal. The Bernicians, north of Hadrian's Wall, and their southern neighbors of Deira fought for dominance. In 616, the heir of Deira reclaimed both realms, forcing Bernician princes into exile among Picts and Irish. Such shifting loyalties explain why the early elegies name Deirans as enemies. The Great Battle of Waigododin is usually placed around 600, though it may fit slightly later during this turmoil. Among the fallen was Heni, son of Nithon, famed for slaying 100 chiefs before he joined the feast at Iden. Even warriors with Celtic names fought against other Celts, for war among neighboring tribes was common. Irish poetry too often dwelt on war. One early poem recalls the kings of Tara, praising their valor. Moen, Lebrad Longsec, Ailil, Wengus Amlongaid, noble warriors and dreaded masters who conquered with their will alone. Its style shows it comes from the 6th or early 7th century, when oral tradition began to be preserved in writing through Christian scribes. Yet Celtic poetry was not all blood and iron. Bards sang praises for their lords, but some verses were composed for simple joy. One scribe, around 845, wrote in the margin of a Latin grammar a brief poem of delight at writing outdoors, surrounded by trees and bird song. A hedge of trees surrounds me, a blackbird sings. Above my booklet the trilling of birds fills the air. In a gray cloak beneath the branches the cuckoo calls. May the Lord protect me, for I write well under the greenwood. The Brittonic tradition also survived in the Book of Taliesin, which preserves poems ascribed to the bard Taliesin, court poet of King Urien of Reged in the 6th century. In The Fold of the Bards, the poet exalts his craft in proud tones, much like the contests of the Ulster women. I am a harmonious one, a clear singer. I am steel, I am a druid, I am a craftsman, I am learned. I am a serpent, I am love, I feast in joy. I am no foolish bard babbling in confusion. Here poetry itself becomes a weapon and a badge of honor, as precious to the Celts as the sword and the feast. Caesar noted that among the Celts, the memorization of verse was especially tied to the Druids, who held roles as priests, judges, and teachers. We would dearly like to have a direct account of their own words, but what survives are views written by outsiders, which may not always be reliable. Alongside this, popular imagination has created its own picture of Druids, often as long-bearded figures of great power. Writers such as Terry Pratchett even parodied this image, with Druids flying megaliths through the skies to repair stone circles as if they were malfunctioning machines. Old tales also connected Druids to monuments like Stonehenge, with stories claiming that Merlin himself brought the stones from Ireland, though by ship rather than through levitation. Scholars have long dismissed these traditions, pointing out that both Merlin and Druids lived centuries after Stonehenge was raised, yet the association between Druids and ancient stones has proved remarkably enduring. In Irish tradition, Druids appear in a different light. One figure, Cath Bad, is described as a powerful Druid in the Ulster cycle. He is introduced as a warrior who roamed Ireland with his band, praised for his knowledge, magic, and strength. He forced marriage upon a princess of Ulster, and through this union fathered Conchobar mac Nessa, who would later become king. Cath Bad himself rose to the highest status as chief druid at Conchobar's court, so respected that even the king deferred to him before speaking. Unlike the Marvel-filled episodes that surround Cuchulainn and other heroes, Cathbad's distinction lay in prophecy. This gift also appears in Christian accounts, such as a 7th century life of Patrick, where Druids foresaw the saint's coming as a dire omen. As Christianity spread, the role of Druids faded, their functions absorbed by the Church. Prophecy, once tied to them, was easily transferred to saints like Columba, remembered both as a prophet and a poet. Stories of Druids clashing with Christian saints also became common. In one tale, a Druid tried to contest the powers of Saint Mahuda, but the saint triumphed by making an apple tree bloom and bear fruit instantly. Columba himself is said to have faced Druids while preaching to the Picts, including one named Breachan, who tried to trap him by controlling the winds of Loch Ness. Columba defied the spell, sailing forward until the wind shifted in his favor. Such accounts cast Druids as masters of nature, yet prophecy and weather lore were not purely magical. Centuries of accumulated observation could have given them practical skill in predicting the seasons or foretelling storms, much as scientists do today. Among the great treasures of early Irish storytelling is the Táin Bó Cúailnge, or Cattle Raid of Cooley. It is the central epic of the Ulster cycle, recounting the war waged by Queen Medb of Connacht and her husband Ailill to seize a mighty brown bull from Ulster. With the men of Ulster disabled by a curse, the young hero Cuchulainn defended his land alone, holding a ford against wave after wave of champions until help could arrive. Later, monks treated Cuchulainn as a figure of history, calculating dates for his life, while modern scholarship tends to see the tale as legend. Its complex network of characters has even been compared to modern superhero stories. Still, archaeology suggests that clashes between Ulster and Connacht may have had some basis in reality. Defensive works, such as the Black Pig's Dyke, with massive timber palisades, point to a need to block cattle raiders. At the Dorsey in South Armagh, tree ring dating shows major fortifications were raised in 140 and 95 BC, linking them to this same period of tension. At Navan Fort, identified as Emen Macha, a great building supported by an enormous timber post was constructed in 95 BC, showing that these stories echo a time of upheaval and defense, even if the details grew legendary over centuries. Sometimes tales dismissed as myth have been given new life by archaeology. One poem speaks of King Eochaid Eirem and his feats, including the building of a great causeway. Long thought imaginary, this gained fresh interest when a timber trackway was uncovered at Corleia in Longford, built in 148 BC, across the boglands near the Shannon. Some have argued that this matches the causeway attributed to Eochaid, and even suggested that the townland name Larug preserves the memory of the event. The discovery sparked debates about how far back oral tradition might stretch. While many historians remain skeptical about legends surviving for thousands of years, the Corleia Causeway shows that at least some details could preserve genuine echoes of the past. The Irish annals, compiled by monks over more than 1,000 years, offer a clearer record. They began as simple notes of important years, such as the death of a king, and were later collected into manuscripts continued by generations of scribes. The Annals of the Four Masters, compiled in the 17th century, brought together many such records, some now lost. Though its early, prehistoric entries cannot be taken as history, the work remains an invaluable source. And when archaeology, tree ring dating, and ancient tales converge, as at Corleia, they hint at the remarkable endurance of memory across centuries. The idea that history in Britain and Ireland might have been preserved through an oral tradition of poets and learned men has long been an attractive one. Yet, when we look at the sources, there are very few references to oral accounts being used. Instead, medieval writers often lamented the absence of native written records. In the early 6th century, Gildas complained that if records of Roman Britain had ever existed, they had been destroyed in towns burnt by Saxon raiders or taken away by exiles. Gildas was a moralist more than a historian, and his sermon, The Ruin of Britain, survived only because it was preserved among Christian writings. This text became one of the few voices from a period otherwise silent. By the 8th or 9th century, the first attempt at a history of Britain was produced under the name of Nennius. In his prologue, he blamed his own people for neglecting to preserve their past. He claimed to have gathered whatever he could find: traditions, monuments, Roman annals, and church chronicles. The result was a mixture of myth and history, with more invention than fact. A similar frustration appears in an Irish text of the late 9th or 10th century, where the writer scolded the Irish for boasting of fabulous deeds while failing to write down their true achievements. This theme of loss and nostalgia reached its most famous expression with Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century. Likely of Breton descent, Geoffrey longed for a glorious Celtic past. While studying in Oxford, he claimed to have been given an ancient book in the British tongue by his friend Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. From this, he said, he created the History of the Kings of Britain, finished around 1138. He traced the rulers of Britain from Brutus of Troy, a supposed descendant of Aeneas, through legendary kings, down to figures known from Welsh inscriptions. His account devoted great detail to Arthur, transforming a half-remembered war leader into an imperial conqueror. This image of Arthur rivaled the grandeur of Greek and Roman heroes, and his popularity guaranteed Geoffrey's success. Critics mocked his inventions, but the sheer delight of his readers ensured that his work shaped British legend for centuries. Geoffrey's history was not the translation of a single book, as he claimed, but a compilation of many sources. He drew on the Historia Brittonum, the Annales Cambriae, Welsh genealogies, and his own imaginative interpretations. Often he invented kings to explain place names, such as Lud for London or Lear for Leicester, though both were actually Roman foundations. This practice of creating ancestors from names was part of a wider tradition, stretching back to Isidore of Seville, who had joked that Britons were so named because they were brutes. Earlier compilers had turned such insults into boasts, linking Britain to Brutus, the imagined grandson of Aeneas, hero of Troy, and founder of Rome in Virgil's Aeneid. By attaching Brutus to Aeneas's line, the Britons could claim a history as grand as that of the Romans. In the Christian Middle Ages, it was often church scholars who wove these stories, drawing on the Bible as well as classical works. The book of Genesis provided a universal framework. All peoples were descended from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From this model, medieval historians mapped Celtic origins onto biblical genealogies. The Historia Brittonum traced Brutus from Japheth through Javan, linking the Britons with the Greeks and Trojans. Later, the Irish compilation known as the Book of the Taking of Ireland opened with Genesis, and then traced the Irish to Japheth's sons Magog and Gomer. Biblical names of distant peoples were reinterpreted as ancestors of the Gaels, while the Scythians and Cimmerians of the northern steppe were worked into the story. Ezekiel's image of Gog and Magog as terrifying northern riders, combined with Josephus's identification of Magog with the Scythians, gave authority to these tales. In this way, Ireland and Britain were given heroic, biblical, and classical pedigrees, ensuring their people a place among the great nations of the world, even if much of the history was invention. The Gauls were described as tall people with fair skin and hair that they often treated to make even lighter. They regularly washed their hair with lime water and brushed it back, giving it a stiff appearance like the mane of a horse. Some men shaved their faces completely. Others kept short beards, while nobles usually left their mustaches to grow long enough to cover their mouths. In travel and in war, they made use of two-horse chariots, which carried both a fighter and a driver. Against mounted troops, they would throw spears from the chariot before dismounting to fight on foot with swords. Many of them showed such disregard for death that they entered battle with little more than a loincloth, completely unarmored. Their war trumpets had a strange, harsh tone that echoed across the battlefield and added to the chaos of combat. By the mid-1st century BC, when Caesar fought his campaigns in Gaul, chariots were no longer part of warfare, having been replaced by cavalry. But in earlier encounters, such as in northern Italy in 225 BC, Gauls did indeed use chariots, and some fought without armor. The land they occupied extended beyond modern France, reaching to the Rhine and including Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland. The Romans distinguished between Transalpine Gaul, across the Alps, and Cisalpine Gaul, on the Italian side. Caesar noted that Gaul was divided into three main groups: the Belgae, the Aquitani, and those who called themselves Celts, whom the Romans referred to as Gauls. Each spoke a different language. The Belgae seem to have spoken a Celtic tongue. The Aquitani used a language ancestral to Basque, while along the southern coast, the Ligurians had their own tongue. The language of the Gauls themselves is now recognized as belonging to the same family as Breton, Welsh, and Gaelic. Greek observers had known of these peoples centuries earlier. Sailors and traders reported encounters with Celts near Narbo and Massalia. Hecataeus of Miletus, around 500 BC, left one of the first written records of them. Herodotus knew of Celts living beyond the western seas and believed the Danube rose in their lands, though his geography was confused. Aristotle later clarified that the Pyrenees, not Iberia, marked the region. While their knowledge was fragmentary, it showed that Greeks were among the first to piece together information about the distant lands of Central Europe. In fact, Celts had long been living north of the Alps, around the upper reaches of the Danube. Modern archaeology has confirmed the cultural sequence of these peoples. In the Austrian Alps, the salt mines at Hallstatt revealed a cemetery in 1846 where miners had been buried, their tools and clothing preserved by salt. These finds, dating mainly to the 7th and 6th centuries BC, gave the name Hallstatt culture to a widespread Iron Age society. Later, discoveries at La Tène on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland revealed a different phase, beginning around 460 BC. Thousands of artifacts were uncovered there, including weapons, decorative metalwork, and even a preserved chariot wheel. The presence of chariots distinguished this culture from the earlier Hallstatt tradition. As similar finds emerged across France and northern Italy, scholars connected them with the historic movements of the Gauls into the Po Valley, described by ancient writers. In this way, the material culture of Hallstatt and La Tène came to be seen as the archaeological expression of the Celtic world. The key element that set the chariot apart was its remarkable speed. The earliest wheeled vehicles were heavy wagons with solid wheels, designed for carrying produce or serving as mobile shelters. The development of the spoked wheel transformed this design, making it lighter and faster. With a minimal frame, no driver's seat, a single axle, and the power of swift horses, the chariot became a vehicle of unmatched agility. It was, in many ways, the sports car of antiquity, valued for both speed and maneuverability. In the Bronze Age across the Near East, Egypt, and Greece, it became the vehicle of choice for rulers and warriors of high status. Maintaining such a force was costly, requiring trained drivers, warriors, horse handlers, and skilled craftsmen. Chariots were used not only in battle, but also in hunting and ceremonies, where more decorated versions appeared. Among Celtic communities, the chariot appears most clearly in the graves of elite warriors buried with their weapons. While wooden frames rarely survive, the presence of metal fittings reveals their existence. Important discoveries of such burials were made in France during the 19th century, particularly in the Marne region, where many graves contained chariot remains from the early La Tène period. Yet the paradox is that while no complete chariots have been unearthed in Ireland, it is there that the richest traditions about them survive in myth and legend. The wetland site of Ederclune in Longford has preserved wooden wheels from the different periods, ranging from the Bronze Age through the medieval era, but none belonging to a full chariot. Meanwhile, Irish epics, such as the Táin Bó Cúailnge, written down many centuries later, describe heroic warriors riding war chariots, narrowing the gap between archaeological finds and cultural memory. Though embellished by medieval scholars, tales of figures like Cú Chulainn still reflect echoes of an older tradition. His chariot, drawn by two horses of supernatural origin, recalls parallels from Greek epic, where Achilles drives divine steeds gifted by the wind. Historical records confirm that chariots remained in use in Britain long after they disappeared elsewhere. Julius Caesar reported encountering them during his expedition of 54 BC, and they were still employed in the revolt of Boudica a century later. Even in post-Roman times, references appear in early poetry and legal texts, which use the word carpat for such vehicles. Chariots are also depicted on Irish high crosses, often in connection with legendary stories. While sometimes viewed as literary devices, the combined weight of archaeology, law, and art confirms their role in Celtic life. Burials in Britain have sparked debates about connections with continental traditions. Ancient authors noted tribes with the same names on both sides of the Channel. One striking example is the Parisi, recorded near the Seine with their capital at Lutetia, and in Britain with a settlement in Yorkshire. Excavations in northern France, including discoveries near present-day Paris, revealed richly furnished chariot burials dating to the 3rd century BC. One warrior was buried with his weapons, while another individual, possibly a figure of religious standing, was interred with an ornamented chariot and a collection of unusual objects thought to be amulets. Across the Channel, in Yorkshire, the Arras culture displayed its own form of chariot burial. Unlike the French examples, the vehicles here were dismantled, and the dead were placed in crouched positions. Analysis of skeletal remains shows that many of those buried were local to the chalk lands of the region, indicating cultural continuity rather than large-scale migration. Nevertheless, Earlier burials, such as those at Ferry Fryston and Newbridge near Edinburgh, suggest that the practice had deeper roots. The Newbridge find, dating to the 5th century BC, lies at the very dawn of the La Tène era, making it one of the earliest chariot burials in the British Isles. Although no human remains survived there to confirm origins, the discovery highlights the long and complex history of the chariot in Celtic Europe, where it stood as both a practical tool of war and a powerful symbol of status and belief. When the Celtic warriors advanced into northern Italy in 225 BC, their discipline and the deafening sound of their war horns struck fear into the Romans. According to Polybius, the blaring of countless instruments, combined with the chanting of battle hymns, created such a roar that it seemed to echo from the very hills. The mysterious instrument responsible for much of this effect was the carnix, a long, vertical trumpet with a bell shaped like an animal's head, often a boar. It was not unique to the Celts, as it later appeared with the Dacians on Trajan's column in Rome, suggesting that it spread across regions during the 4th century BC. The carnix was more than a tool for intimidation. Like other trumpets throughout history, it helped carry orders over the noise of battle. Leaders such as Vercingetorix are said to have used it to rally their troops during great clashes against Rome. For a long time, only fragments of these instruments were known, the most famous being a boar's head found in Scotland in the early 19th century. Attempts at reconstruction, such as those carried out in the 1990s, relied heavily on depictions and imagination. That changed dramatically in 2004, when excavations at a Gallic sanctuary in central France revealed the remains of 7 carnices alongside other weapons, helmets, and offerings. The pit in which they were buried contained objects deliberately broken, a practice connected with dedicating spoils of war to the gods. Among them was a boar-headed carnix that could be pieced together, finally giving scholars the means to recreate its form with accuracy. Tests with a brass replica showed that the sound was harsh and difficult to produce, yet perfectly suited for the chaos of combat. The shrine where these instruments were uncovered once belonged to the tribe known as the Limovici. Though later rebuilt as a Romano-Gallic complex complete with a theater, its earlier form was simpler, consisting of timber structures used for ritual gatherings, sacrifices, and feasts. Roman accounts describe how Celtic warriors vowed the spoils of victory to their gods, piling weapons and treasures on sacred ground. Such practices explain how these carnices survived, safeguarded by religious devotion. While the Romans identified local war gods with their own Mars, the exact deity honored at this sanctuary remains uncertain. The discoveries at Tintignac reveal a close cultural link between the Gauls and the peoples of Britain and Ireland, where memories of war chariots, hornblowers, and heroic warriors persisted in later epics. Caesar himself noted similarities between the island Celts and those of the continent. For many years, it was believed that Celtic-speaking groups spread into these lands only during the La Tène period, from the mid-1st millennium BC onward. Yet the evidence is more complex. While chariot burials of that era certainly appear in Britain, Celtic languages were spoken in regions such as Ireland and Iberia much earlier, suggesting a deeper and more ancient presence. Greek traders provided some of the earliest glimpses into these western lands. Sailors from Phocaea in Asia Minor were among the first to venture beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, drawn by tales of Tartessos, a wealthy city in southern Spain. By the late 7th century BC, merchants like Kolaios of Samos were returning home with enormous profits from trading in its mineral riches. the Phoenicians had already established colonies in the region, including the city of Cadiz, to access the same resources. Reports from later Greek writers describe Tartessos as a thriving center of trade, with gold, copper, and tin arriving from Celtic territories further inland. The ruler of Tartessos was known as Argantonios, a name rooted in the Celtic word for silver. Similar names are found across Europe in later centuries, appearing on coins and in records of chieftains. Some believe Argantonios was not a single individual, but a hereditary title, which might explain claims of his impossibly long reign. What is certain is that the presence of such a name in Iberia reveals Celtic influence centuries before the cultural horizon usually associated with Latin. Inscriptions from the region, written in scripts adapted from Phoenician, remain debated, but they hint at the complexity of languages and identities in pre-Roman Spain. Whether or not Tartessos itself spoke a Celtic tongue, it was clearly tied into a wider network of Celtic-speaking peoples who controlled trade and resources long before Rome came to dominate the West. The earliest recorded names for Britain and Ireland already show Celtic roots. These names seem to have been known to sailors before material culture associated with the Latin tradition reached either island. Beyond that point, the historical record becomes fragmentary, surviving only in scattered references passed down from earlier authors. In the 4th century AD, Rufus Festus Avienus wrote a lengthy poem, Ora Maritima, which drew on sources from centuries earlier. In it, he credited the Carthaginian navigator Himilco, who around 500 BC explored the distant northwestern coasts of Europe. The poem describes a ridge called Ustrimnis, facing the sea, and a nearby bay dotted with islands. Modern scholars link this to Ushant off the coast of Brittany and the surrounding archipelago. Avienus then relates how, 2 days' sail beyond, lay the Sacred Isle, rich in resources and densely settled by the Hierni, with the Albiones inhabiting a neighboring island. These names clearly refer to Ireland and Britain. The term Hierni reflects an older form of the Irish word for their own land, while Albion connects to ancient Celtic words for land or world. Such names suggest that Celtic-speaking communities were already present in the islands well before Latin influences appeared. Recognition of this has challenged the older belief that Celtic identity spread into Western Europe only through Latin culture. Some scholars since the early 20th century have instead argued that the bell beaker phenomenon may have been the earliest carrier of Celtic languages. Recent genetic studies have provided evidence that gives weight to this theory, though the relationship is complex and far from straightforward. The Beaker Horizon, dated roughly between 2800 and 1700 BC, spread across much of Europe in distinctive patches, often favoring areas rich in metal ores. Its most recognizable marker is a style of pottery shaped like an inverted bell and decorated with bands of patterns. The striking changes brought about by metallurgy played a central role in this culture. Early metalworkers, able to transform dull ores into shining copper through fire, must have seemed to their contemporaries like masters of hidden powers. The Beaker people's vessels are often assumed to have been drinking cups, reinforcing the idea of male feasting rituals and the widespread use of alcohol. Indeed, residues in some examples show traces of early beer made from wheat, and in others mead from honey. Yet these pots were not restricted to drinking. Some held food, others were used in funerary rites, and a few even served in metallurgical processes. Their varying sizes, some with capacities of up to 20 liters, suggest that the shape was practical for lifting and handling, not solely for drinking. Alcohol undoubtedly played a role in their society, but it was not a novelty brought solely by the beaker people. Evidence of brewing stretches much further back, with fermented beverages already present among earlier farming communities. Sites such as Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia hint at beer being part of communal rituals as early as 9000 BC. By the time of the beaker expansions, the practice of brewing was already well established, though it was clearly embraced and woven into the life of these communities. Thus, while bell beaker culture is not the simple origin point of Celtic identity, it represents a powerful blend of technological innovation, ritual practice, and cultural exchange that may well have carried the first Celtic languages across Western Europe. Bell beaker pottery has been uncovered across an enormous range, stretching eastward to Poland, south to northern Morocco, north into Scotland and Denmark, and even as far as southern Norway. This raises the question of whether the pots themselves traveled widely, or if the knowledge of their manufacture spread through communities. Modern analysis has helped answer this. For example, a finely preserved beaker discovered near Exeter in 2012 was shown under the microscope to have been made from local clay, suggesting it was produced at the very spot where it was found. Broader studies in France, Portugal, Spain, and Switzerland confirm that most beakers were locally made, though their style and techniques circulated widely. These pots were hand-built, not wheel-thrown, which implies they were household creations, most likely crafted by women. Since women often moved to their husbands' homes after marriage, they would have carried pottery traditions with them, spreading styles across regions. The bell beaker horizon ushered in the Bronze Age in Western Europe. Its people were the first metalworkers to enter the British Isles, targeting the copper belts of Ireland and Wales. Around 2400 BC, they began mining at Ross Island in Ireland, producing copper ingots directly at the site. They deliberately sought out arsenic-rich ores to create a stronger alloy than pure copper. From there, trade networks carried Irish copper into Britain. By 2200 BC, attention had shifted to Cornwall, where valuable tin was mined, along with deposits in Ireland's Mourne Mountains. The combination of copper and tin gave the Isles an advantage in producing bronze. Iberia and Central Europe also had tin supplies, and places such as Bragança in Portugal reveal the full cycle of Bronze Age life: herding, hunting, pottery, and metalwork by about 1750 to 1500 BC. At this site, later crude versions of beaker pottery appear alongside evidence of bronze smelting, showing continuity of traditions at the dawn of metallurgy. Burial customs within the bell beaker world varied, but certain patterns stand out. In Ireland and Iberia, older megalithic tombs were reused, while in Western Ireland, wedge-shaped tombs unique to the period also appeared. For a long time, it was thought that collective burials were confined to the southern and Atlantic regions, while individual graves dominated the east, but recent studies suggest both practices occurred throughout the beaker sphere. High-status burials often stood apart. Some included timber-lined chambers, finely decorated beakers, and personal items such as V-shaped buttons, wrist guards, and arrowheads. While archery gear is usually associated with men, one notable burial of a woman in Bohemia included arrows and a wrist guard. A few graves stand out as exceptional. At Hulín Pravčic in the Czech lands, richly furnished burials included copper daggers, rare items among beaker graves, and ornaments of gold, silver, amber, and electrum. Stone sets thought to symbolize smiths' tools suggest the buried individuals were skilled metalworkers. In Britain, the so-called Amesbury archer, buried near Stonehenge around 2350 BC, offers a remarkable case. Isotope testing shows he came originally from the Alpine region. Despite suffering painful injuries and illness, he was interred with an extraordinary wealth of grave goods, including 5 beakers, gold ornaments, wrist guards, and several copper knives, likely from Spain and France. His burial is the richest beaker grave in Britain. Other finds reinforce the prestige of metalworkers. At Kirkhow in northern England, a burial mound contained a beaker, a cushion stone, and gold hair ornaments, similar to those of the Amesbury archer. These graves suggest that metalworking skill brought status, wealth, and far-reaching connections. Gold, too soft for tools, was nonetheless highly prized for ornamentation. Deposits in Iberia, Ireland, and Britain produced many of the finest examples of beaker-era gold work. Among the most striking objects are lunulae, crescent-shaped collars, engraved with geometric designs similar to those on beaker pottery. These were probably not personal possessions, but ceremonial regalia passed from one custodian to another. Found throughout the Atlantic zone, particularly in Ireland, lunulae and other golden ornaments seem to have symbolized celestial powers of the sun and moon, tying the bell beaker world into the broader religious and artistic traditions of Bronze Age Europe. When archaeologists first identified the bell beaker phenomenon, it was generally assumed that it spread through waves of migration. Later, in the 1970s, a new school of thought emerged in Britain that rejected large-scale movements of people and instead interpreted bell beaker as the spread of ideas and customs. For several decades, this cultural explanation dominated. In more recent years, however, the balance has shifted again, as growing evidence points to significant mobility. The miners who began working copper at Ross Island clearly came from outside, and the man later called the Amesbury archer had origins far from Britain. Scientific techniques such as isotope analysis provide valuable insight, though they can usually only identify first-generation migrants. Near the grave of the Amesbury archer, another burial was found belonging to a younger man born in Britain who lived a generation or two later. Both men shared a rare trait in the bones of their feet, proving they were related. This family link illustrates how newcomers could settle and establish lineages in their adopted lands. Studies of more than 250 bell beaker individuals across Britain confirm that most were not first-generation migrants, though signs of local and regional movement were common. Research from Austria, Bavaria, the Czech lands, and Hungary reveals a similar pattern. Of 81 individuals examined, over half had moved during their lifetime. Differences in skeletal shape have also long been noted. Bell beaker burials in Northern and Eastern Europe often display skull forms distinct from earlier populations. At first, this was taken as direct evidence of incoming groups. Yet cultural practices, such as how infants were laid to sleep, can also affect head shape. For this reason, DNA analysis provides a more reliable measure of ancestry and continuity. Linguistic evidence adds another dimension. The Celtic and Italic branches of speech belong to the larger Indo-European family, which links much of Europe and parts of Asia through a common parent tongue. Beyond the broad similarities, scholars have also identified features shared specifically between Celtic and Italic, suggesting that at some stage they were closely connected before evolving into distinct traditions. Today, millions of people speak Romance languages such as French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese all descended from Latin, the language spread across Europe by the Roman Empire. Yet before Rome's rise, Latin was only one of several Italic languages in central Italy, squeezed between the Etruscans to the north and Greek colonies to the south. Over time, Rome subdued the other Italic peoples, absorbed the Etruscans, and eventually expanded outward to build an empire that swept over much of Celtic Europe. To understand the earlier linguistic landscape of Western Europe, we need to step back before Rome's dominance. Ancient writers recorded many Celtic place names, both within the empire and beyond. In Gaul, the abundance of such names supports Caesar's statement that the region was largely Celtic-speaking before conquest. In Iberia, Celtic names appear across much of the peninsula, though with notable gaps. Britain, too, shows Celtic place names in Roman records, while the lack of them in Western Ireland and northern Scotland is due more to limited Roman knowledge than to absence of Celtic language. Ptolemy's geography, for example, preserves the name of the Caledonians in northern Scotland, linked to the Celtic word calet, meaning tough or hardy. If we look at migration patterns before Roman expansion, we see Celtic names spread across the Po Valley, the Balkans, and areas around the Black Sea, tied to Gallic movements south and east after 500 BC. East of the Rhine, however, the presence of Celtic names indicates that Celtic speech was established there before Germanic expansion. Even the name of the Rhine itself is Celtic, and ancient poetry describes it as a sacred river for the Celts. In Iberia and Britain, the picture is more complicated. Roman authors mention migrations of Gauls into Iberia and of Belgae into Britain, and archaeology supports cultural shifts in these regions during the early centuries BC. But Greek accounts show Celtic names in these places centuries earlier, suggesting repeated waves of migration, some well before recorded history. When we compare the Celtic and Italic languages, certain shared features point to a close connection. Both come from the broader Indo-European family, but they also share specific traits such as a similar genitive singular ending in I, the superlative suffix isimo, and a subjunctive form built with ai. These parallels have led many linguists to propose a common ancestor called Proto-Italo-Celtic. This does not mean a form of Celtic, but rather a parent language from which both Italic and Celtic branched. Others suggest that the two groups developed side by side, influencing one another. The debate has continued for more than a century, with arguments swinging between support and rejection of a shared ancestor. Some scholars argue that their similarities reflect only a short period of common development, followed by long separate histories. Complicating the picture are other ancient languages, such as Ligurian and Lusitanian, which seem related but do not fit neatly into either the Celtic or Italic branches. These may also descend from the same ancestor. If so, the earliest spread of Indo-European languages in Western Europe may have been tied to the people of the Bell Beaker culture. For a long time, it was thought that Ligurians stretched from northern Italy across to western Iberia, while Lusitanians were established in Portugal by the early Bronze Age. More recent evidence, however, suggests Lusitanian-speaking groups may have arrived later, leaving the question of the Beaker people's language open. One influential idea is that the Bell Beaker communities spoke an early form of Indo-European too archaic to show specifically Celtic or Italic traits. The scholar Hans Krahe highlighted the presence of river names across Europe that appear Indo-European, yet cannot be linked to any known branch. He saw these as survivals from an older stratum of Indo-European, perhaps ancestral to Celtic and Italic. Even though his conclusions have been debated, they reveal the complexity of language layering in prehistoric Europe. In Iberia, for instance, many ancient place names begin with P, a sound that disappeared in early Celtic. Such details point to a stage of Indo-European older than either Celtic or Italic. The first language carried by the Beaker communities may therefore have belonged to this deep, early stratum of Indo-European speech, predating the later divisions that gave rise to the Celtic and Italic families. Sanskrit, no matter how old it may be, was recognized early on as a language of remarkable design. It appeared more refined than Greek, richer in vocabulary than Latin, and yet shared deep similarities with both. The parallels in verb roots and grammar were far too strong to be coincidence, pointing instead to a shared ancestral source that had long since vanished. The same reasoning suggested connections to Celtic, Gothic, and Old Persian. These insights were famously expressed in 1786 by Sir William Jones, who had recently begun his study of Sanskrit while serving as a judge in India. Jones was already an exceptional linguist, having mastered numerous languages, from the classical tongues of Europe to Arabic, Persian, and Celtic. His statement became the cornerstone for a new scientific approach to the study of languages. The similarities between Sanskrit and Europe's classical languages are easy to see. Words like Peter in Sanskrit correspond to pater in Latin and Greek, and matar matches mater and meter. Earlier observers had noticed these resemblances, but Jones and others focused on grammar as well as vocabulary, recognizing that the systems of inflection revealed true kinship. From this foundation grew the concept of the Indo-European family of languages, formally identified in the early 19th century and studied intensely ever since. Celtic belongs firmly to this family. The process by which language families form is simple. Communities change their speech over time, and when groups separate and lose regular contact, their dialects evolve into distinct languages. The ancestral tongue that gave rise to Indo-European, reconstructed by linguists, is known as Proto-Indo-European. The search for its homeland has stirred debate for centuries. Some scholars placed it in Anatolia, linking its spread to the first farmers of the Neolithic. This theory was attractive because farming often drove the expansion of languages. Yet the reconstructed vocabulary of Proto-Indo-European contains words for plows, wagons, wool, wine, and dairy products, things unknown to the earliest farmers. This makes it difficult to accept such an early origin. Others supported the Anatolian view by using computer models designed with assumptions favorable to it, but these results failed independent tests. What we do know is that Proto-Indo-European was never written down. Literacy emerged only in urban societies with centralized states, and PIE speakers lived before that stage. The first written Indo-European language was Hittite, preserved in inscriptions from central Anatolia. Yet Hittite shows influence from the older local language, Hattic, while PIE itself does not. This suggests that the Indo-European homeland was not in Anatolia, but elsewhere. A more convincing model places PIE on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Its vocabulary includes words for wheeled vehicles, which date no earlier than about 3,500 BC. The people of the Yamnaya culture match the lifestyle implied by PIE, mobile herders using wagons, living in kin-based groups, and expanding both east and west. Contact with Proto-Uralic, the ancestor of Finnish, Sami, and related languages, is evident in shared vocabulary. This places PIE to the south of the Uralic homeland, but still in a zone where steppe societies met farming communities further south. P also borrowed from Proto-Semitic, likely via cultural exchanges through the Caucasus, where the Makop culture connected the steppe to the civilizations of Mesopotamia. Ancient DNA studies strengthen this picture. Massive movements of people from the steppe during the Copper and Bronze Ages reshaped the European gene pool, leaving a genetic legacy still visible today. These findings align with the linguistic evidence of widespread Indo-European expansion. Deeper still, some fundamental words are shared between PIE and Uralic, hinting at early contact or even a common stage before the two families split. This points back toward Siberia, where the ancestors of Uralic speakers lived, and suggests that the story of Indo-European languages reaches much further into prehistory than once thought. In the valley of the Angara River, which flows out of Lake Baikal in central Siberia, the burial of a 4-year-old child took place some 24,000 years ago. Discovered in the late 1920s near the village of Malta, his remains were placed in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. The grave suggests he was deeply cherished. He was laid to rest with a necklace of beads, pendants, and an ivory headband. His community lived as hunters of reindeer and mammoth, and they expressed themselves through art. From mammoth tusks, they carved small figurines of women, some decorated to represent fur clothing, as well as birds and images of mammoths. Their homes were round huts with central hearths, providing warmth and light against the backdrop of the Ice Age. Among the sites of this era, Malta stands out for the richness and variety of its art. Beyond this, the child himself has left us an extraordinary legacy. His DNA, which has been studied in detail and has revealed unexpected connections. Roughly 4 millennia later, a new method of stone tool-making emerged in the same region: pressure blade technology. This innovation spread eastward into North America and westward across Eurasia. Scientists were able to compare Malta Boy's genetic profile with that of a man from Afontova Gora, dated to about 17,000 years ago, and found close similarities. Afontova Gora is also linked with pressure blade production, suggesting continuity in both people and technology. The technique itself represented a major leap forward. For thousands of years, tools had been shaped by striking stones to break off flakes. Pressure flaking, by contrast, required clamping a piece of stone, most often obsidian, and carefully applying steady force to detach slim, sharp blades with uniform edges. Obsidian was especially prized for its razor-sharp quality, sharper even than surgical steel when freshly cut. The skill was preserved for thousands of years, still in use among the Aztecs when recorded by Spanish observers. Because of its difficulty, the technique was likely passed down within families and spread through migration. It first appeared around 20,000 BC in the regions of Mongolia, northern China, and Lake Baikal, then moved west to the upper Volga around 9,600 BC. By 9000 BC, it had spread north of the Black Sea, and soon after, southward into the Near East, where early farmers adopted it. Long obsidian blades have been uncovered at Sayonu Tepesi in levels dated to about 7,000 BC. Within a few centuries, the technology had reached western Anatolia, coinciding with the growth of dairy farming, which then spread into Europe. By around 4,800 BC, the Cucuteni Tripoli culture north of the Black Sea combined this advanced tool-making with large herds of cattle, marking the rise of a powerful new way of life. Another important technological advance also moved westward from the Lake Baikal region: pottery. Long before the spread of farming, hunter-gatherers in the Far East were already making ceramic vessels. This knowledge gradually traveled across Siberia and reached the Middle Volga in the Samara region by around 7000 BC. From there, pottery making spread further into the river valleys of the European steppe. Alongside these vessels, genetic traits connected with the populations represented by the Malta and Afontova Gora burials also appeared in the region, showing that technology and people often moved together. The survival of male hunter-gatherer lineages during the advance of farming depended on their ability, or willingness, to adopt new ways of life. A clear example can be seen in the forest steppe, where the pottery-making communities of the Dnieper Donets, the Fornovan culture, transitioned into the Dnieper Donets II culture, becoming cattle herders around 5000 BC. Analysis of their ancient DNA reveals a mixture of maternal lineages, those typical of European foragers, some connected to early European farmers, and others linked to Central Asia. This suggests that women played an essential role in the spread of skills and traditions. A woman skilled in pottery may have been especially valued when ceramics first reached the region, just as a farming woman might have been sought after later, perhaps even bringing livestock as part of a dowry. This blend of traditions helped shape the cultural mosaic that later contributed to the Yamnaya horizon, which spread rapidly across the steppe and absorbed many earlier societies, eventually merging with the remains of the Cucuteni Tripoli culture. Linguistic reconstruction gives us another window into this period. Roughly 1,500 Proto-Indo-European roots have been identified, though this is only a fraction of the full language. Even so, the vocabulary provides insights into the life of its speakers. They were familiar with farming, metallurgy, wheeled vehicles, and dairy production. They had words for sheep and wool, and a sense of social hierarchy, but little terminology linked to cities, specialized jobs, or complex administration. This points not to an urban society, but to mobile pastoralists, a lifestyle that aligns closely with the Yamnaya culture of the steppe. The Yamnaya horizon, flourishing between 3,400 and the 2,800 BC, was the outcome of multiple influences. At the same time, the Balkans hosted some of Europe's most advanced farming societies. In the lower Danube basin, communities built substantial villages with multi-room houses and cultivated fertile soils. These early farmers became pioneers in working copper and were also the first in the world to craft gold. Yet this progress did not last. From 4,200 to 3,800 BC, a period of climatic cooling struck Europe. Settlements in the Balkans were abandoned, metallurgy collapsed, and copper mines in Bulgaria fell silent. Some metalworkers may have escaped westward, carrying their knowledge into places like Italy and Sardinia, ensuring that their skills were not entirely lost. The Cucuteni Tripoli communities emerged between the Carpathians and the Middle Dniester around 5,200 to 5,000 BC, gradually spreading northeast until they bordered the Dnieper Donets II culture. They survived the great climatic downturn by adapting, turning increasingly to cattle herding and the use of milk. This marked an early stage of what has been called the secondary products revolution, when animals were no longer valued only for meat, but also for renewable resources such as milk, wool, and traction power. With oxen pulling sledges and plows, and horses and donkeys used for transport and riding, societies could expand their productivity without greater human effort. Those who adopted these practices gained both wealth and mobility. Evidence of wheeled vehicles first appears in Latte Cucuteni Tripoli levels as miniature models of carts and toys. By around 3600 BC, depictions of ox-drawn sledges appear, hinting that the simple step of adding wheels transformed them into carts. Alongside this, a primitive plow, or ayard, fashioned from elk antlers, was in use, with animal bones showing signs of yoking. Horses ran wild across the steppe at this time and were first tamed for riding rather than traction, while oxen remained the draft animals for the heavy early wagons. In the North Caucasus, the Maykop culture, 4000 to 3100 BC, introduced arsenic copper alloys that served as a precursor to true bronze. They buried their leaders beneath earth mounds, a practice mirrored soon after by neighboring steppe groups. The Rapin culture, developing between the Volga and Ural rivers around 4000 BC, gave rise to the burial customs that became typical of the Yamnaya horizon. Single graves under round barrows, later called kurgans. By 3400 BC, the fully developed Yamnaya culture appears, with a mobile, wagon-based pastoral economy that spread quickly across the European steppe. Its most visible legacy is the kurgan, often containing individuals of high rank, sometimes accompanied by wagons or toolkits marking their role as smiths. New weapons like tanged daggers and shaft-hole axes reflected technological links to Maykop. Distinctive ornaments, spiral hair rings, bone toggles, and decorated discs also marked their material culture. Climate played a major role in these expansions. The collapse of farming societies in the Balkans during the cold centuries after 4200 BC opened space for herders to occupy new pastures. Cultures like Chernavoda in the lower Danube may represent the early divergence of Anatolian Indo-European languages, separating before the invention of the wheel, but after the use of sledges and animal traction. Later, around 3200 BC, conditions again became harsher, with steppe aridity peaking between 2700 and 2000 BC, driving further migrations. The Yamnaya horizon expanded eastward as well as westward. Around 3300 to 3000 BC, groups from the Volga-Ural region pushed nearly 2,000 kilometers to the Altai, creating the first true mobile pastoralist society beyond the Urals. Centuries later, the languages known as Tocharian were recorded along the Silk Road, retaining unusually archaic features. Westward, Yamnaya merged with late Cucuteni Tripoli farmers to form the Usatovo culture near the Dniester. This may mark the early divergence of the pre-Germanic branch. Subsequent blending further north produced the corded ware culture, 2750 to 2400 BC, which DNA evidence shows descended largely from Yamnia stock. Germanic, when it emerged centuries later, contained a large portion of vocabulary not of Indo-European origin, especially agricultural terms. These seem to have been borrowed from the descendants of Balkan farmers, whose influence reached across languages including Greek, Latin, and Celtic. The mass Yamnaya movement into the Danube Valley between 3100 and 2800 BC left thousands of burials, creating a strong cultural and genetic foundation for later Indo-European dialects. In the Carpathian and Thracian zones, contact between Yamnaya migrants and local cultures likely shaped the ancestors of Greek and Armenian. Archaeological finds, such as anthropomorphic stelae and wheeled burials, illustrate this blending. Other offshoots formed further east. steppe groups mixing with corded ware and Cucuteni Tripoli populations along the Middle Dnieper developed into Proto-Balto-Slavic. Meanwhile, new fortified settlements arose beyond the Urals around 2100 to 1800 BC at Sintashta and Archaim, where the earliest spoked-wheel chariots were found. This marked the beginning of the Indo-Iranian expansion, carried forward by the Andronovo culture. By 2000 BC, their chariots were already valued by rulers in the Near East. By the 8th century BC, the Eurasian steppe was dominated by mounted nomads, whom the Greeks called Scythians. Though often imagined as ancestors of the Celts in medieval lore, they in fact spoke East Iranian dialects, not Celtic. Genetic evidence confirms the distinction, with Scythians carrying Y DNA haplogroup R1a, while Celtic-speaking populations were largely associated with R1b. The steppe story thus diverges, one line leading into the Iranian world, another feeding into the Western migrations that gave rise to Celtic and other Indo-European tongues. Writers in the 2nd century BC recorded that Celtic peoples would spend the night at the tombs of their fallen leaders, seeking communion with them, much as the Nasamones of North Africa consulted the spirits of their ancestors. The Greeks had a word for this, heron, a shrine devoted to the cult of heroes. Archaeology shows that sanctuaries of this type existed among Iron Age Celts, but their origins reach much further back. One clue to these deep roots comes from Yamnaya traditions that later flowed into bell beaker society. Spiral-shaped hairbinders made of precious metals appear both in steppe burials and in Iberian bell beaker graves. Another link is the use of anthropomorphic stelae, upright stones carved with human features that can be traced from the Eurasian steppe all the way to the Atlantic coast. These monuments were connected with Yamnaya copperworking and mark the spread of a new way of life across Europe. The earliest examples are found at sites such as Mikhailovka on the lower Dnieper around 3700 to 3400 BC, where farming and steppe customs merged. Some of these kurgan burials used stone-lined cists, covered with slabs roughly shaped into a head and shoulder outline, the first steps in what became a long tradition of human-like memorial stones. From the Dniester to Crimea and into the Caucasus, the custom spread and flourished. These stelae were designed to stand upright, often worked on both front and back. Finds show that sacrifices, including animal offerings, were made at such stones. Later parallels help explain their meaning. An inscription from the 8th century BC Zinkirli in southeastern Turkey describes a man named Kutamua, who declared that his soul would dwell in the stela he had commissioned. For ancient peoples, stone could preserve the essence of the deceased long after the body decayed. Hundreds of Yamnaya stelae are known, most simple in form, but some decorated with belts, footprints, weapons, or tools. Footprints in particular suggest a symbolic role, perhaps linked to a guide of souls into the afterlife. These monuments spread far beyond the steppe. A chain of discoveries traces their movement through the Balkans into Greece, while another route carried the tradition into the Carpathians and further west. In Romania, examples were found at Hamangia Baia, Tseamurlia de Ios, and Baia de Cris, showing decorated girdles and necklaces. The tradition also followed the lure of metals. Copper resources in the Alps were already attracting attention by 4500 to 4000 BC, with early smelting experiments at sites such as Brixleg in Austria. Soon, mines appeared in northern Italy at Monte Loreto and elsewhere, fostering new Copper Age cultures like Remedello, Rinaldone, and Gaudo. Dating disputes long clouded the picture, but radiocarbon results place the Remedello culture firmly in the period after 3300 BC, contemporary with Yamnaya expansion. Its single grave burials, arsenical copper alloys, and dagger forms closely match steppe traditions. Anthropomorphic stelae in northern Italy and the Western Alps often depict these daggers, showing the cultural fusion at work. Prospectors likely moved west from the Carpathian Basin along the river Sava, across present-day Slovenia, and into the Alpine foothills. Settlers in the Ljubljana marshes built pile dwellings and drew copper from the mountains. Finds there include a remarkably preserved wooden wheel and axle, dated to around 3160 to 3100 BC. This revolving axle design, also known from Switzerland and Germany, was probably part of a two-wheeled cart ideal for alpine terrain. From the Alps to Sardinia, where copper was worked even earlier, the path of metallurgy was accompanied by the enduring presence of stelae, blending technological innovation with ancestral tradition. By the close of the 4th millennium BC, the quest for copper had carried metallurgy west along the Mediterranean, and with it came the tradition of carving stelae. In southern France, the first major copper mining and smelting complex appeared at Cabrières and Perret in the mountains of Languedoc, dating to the late 3rd millennium BC. Images of Remedello-style daggers are carved into rocks both in northern Italy and in southern France, including engravings in the Alpine foothills at Chastel-Arnaud in the Drôme, marking the routes by which copper working spread westward. In this region, clusters of Copper Age anthropomorphic stelae are also found. Iberia, too, became a flourishing center of metallurgy. The earliest copper working sites, such as Cabezo-Juré in the southwest, date to around 3100 BC and were clearly occupied by communities already skilled in metal production. These groups lived in fortified compounds, with elites dining in style, importing luxuries, and controlling access to horses that were likely used to transport ore. The presence of wild horse DNA in modern Iberian breeds supports this early contact. Finds of horse bones together with beaker pottery across Iberia have long encouraged the idea that horse domestication spread with bell beaker. Yet sites like Cabezo-Juré, predating beaker, point instead to horse taming and copper smelting arriving together from the steppe. Two great fortified centers dominated Iberia's Copper Age, Zambojal in Portugal and Los Miares in Spain. Both began as small strongholds and expanded as new defensive walls enclosed ever larger areas. Zambojal's strategic location on a peninsula at the mouth of the Tagus gave it easy access both inland and to the sea. Other strongholds on the same peninsula include Vila Nova de São Pedro and Litea. The fort at Litea, built around 2900 to 2800 BC, shows a sequence of pottery styles ending with bell beaker. Zambojal imported ivory from distant lands and traded local resources such as Tagus gold and copper artifacts. Its workshops used copper, brought from the mining center at Mosissos, deliberately alloyed with arsenic for greater strength in tools and weapons, just as in Remedello culture. Iberia is also rich in carved stelae, ranging in date from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. Anthropomorphic examples are often found in prominent positions within megalithic tombs. Some Neolithic monuments were reused during the Beaker period, while others can be dated securely to the 3rd millennium. Certain carvings clearly belong to the Copper Age, such as the stela from Longroiva in Portugal, which depicts a halberd, bow, and dagger. Many others, like their Yamnaya counterparts, show only minimal human features, sometimes accompanied by symbols like a shepherd's crook. From Iberia, the stela tradition continues north along the Atlantic, into Brittany, and even the Channel Islands. A remarkable link between stelae and the rise of bell beaker is preserved at Petit Chasseur in Sion, Switzerland, where a necropolis was used from the late Neolithic through the Beaker period into the early Bronze Age. Excavations uncovered 28 decorated stelae, divided into early and Beaker period types. A similar site at Aosta in the Italian Alps, better preserved with many stelae still upright, has allowed scholars to reconstruct the original arrangement at Sion. Around 2700 BC, the necropolis was laid out on a solar axis, with communal tombs flanked by a line of anthropomorphic stelae facing the sunrise, an ancestral procession aligned with the heavens. Later, during the Beaker phase, new stelae decorated with Beaker motifs were added, demonstrating continuity. Yet in a dramatic shift, still within the Beaker period, all of the Sion stelae were deliberately broken and reused as slabs for individual cist burials, marking a profound social change. The early stelae at Sion show strong links to the Remedello culture. Several depict Remedello two daggers, while others include belts, stylized arms, and double spiral pendants. With the arrival of Beaker communities, new imagery appeared, emphasizing bows and arrows over axes. 4 steely bear-carved bows, reflecting the prominence of archery in Beaker burials. The detail of clothing is striking. Patterned garments, decorated belts, and even pouch-like accessories resembling sporrans, sometimes with side pockets. These geometric motifs closely resemble those painted on Beaker pottery. Such detail even helps make sense of earlier Yamna carvings, where belts once seen as abstract designs can now be recognized as part of a broader tradition of dress and symbolism linking steppe and Western Europe. The bell beaker culture was first identified more than a century ago, and ever since scholars have debated its origins. Suggested homelands have ranged from Iberia to southeastern France, Sicily, Central Europe, and the Low Countries. Because the distinctive inverted bell pot is the defining object found across the entire bell beaker zone, research initially focused on ceramics. Various styles of decoration have been recognized, many of them regional, but 2 international types have drawn the most attention. One is the all-over corded style, completely covered with cord impressions. The other is called maritime, concentrated along the Atlantic seaboard from Portugal to Brittany. In the 1970s, Dutch archaeologists advanced the influential Dutch model, placing the homeland in the Netherlands, where both AOC and maritime styles are found. This region also lies at the western edge of corded ware distribution, and a local type known as the protruding foot beaker was thought to have evolved into AOC and then into maritime. Radiocarbon evidence overturned this model. The earliest corded ware dates to about 2750 BC, while the first bell beaker examples appear slightly earlier in the 2700s BC. Both cultures existed at the same time, and the oldest beakers come from southern Europe, not the Netherlands. While corded ware and bell beaker overlapped in Central and Eastern Europe, they represent different communities. Their similarities, such as cord-impressed pottery, reflect a shared heritage rooted in Yamnaya traditions. It now appears that bell beaker developed among copper-working groups in southern Europe, who produced bell-shaped pots alongside their metallurgy, Although most beakers were made in domestic settings, some clearly reveal the hand of specialist potters. The maritime style stands out as the classic form. Tall vessels with a flat base and an elegant S-shaped profile, covered with horizontal bands edged by incised lines or chord impressions, often filled with neat hatching. These standardized vases are remarkably consistent, leading some researchers to see them as the archetype from which regional styles, such as the Ciempozuelos of Spain, later derived. The greatest density of these classical maritime beakers lies around the Tagus estuary in Portugal, suggesting this as a key production zone. Iberia was once thought to lack corded variants, but examples have since been identified at fortified Copper Age sites in Portugal and scattered across Spain, though maritime remains dominant. The first bell beaker makers were also coppersmiths, likely descended only a few generations from incoming settlers. At Zambojal, there is direct continuity from early copperworking to bell beaker. While some argue that local cups with slightly wasted forms and grooved decoration evolved into beakers, the case is weak. More plausibly, the beaker design represents a fusion of ideas from distant contacts. Certain decorative vessels from late Neolithic Morocco have been suggested as inspiration, but more direct precedents exist along the migration route from Ukraine into the Carpathian Basin. Inverted bell pots were already being made north of the Black Sea before 4000 BC, and chord impression techniques were common in the same region. Another distinctive feature, filling decoration with white paste made from crushed bone, was already practiced in the Carpathian Basin. These elements could have traveled westward along the same routes that carried copperworking to Iberia. Migration often followed familiar paths, with scouts locating metal sources and returning to share news or bring back kin. This pattern explains expansion at Lycia, where new arrivals in the 17th century BC established huts outside the fortifications containing only beaker pottery, while the older settlement inside the walls slowly adopted maritime forms. Such finds illustrate how cultural shifts could be introduced by newcomers and then integrated over time. While ceramic origins have attracted the most study, bell beaker was far more than a pottery style. Edward Sangmeister, a German prehistorian excavating Zambojal in the mid-20th century, argued that beaker culture spread outward from Iberia into Central Europe, and later returned to Iberia enriched with new influences. His reflux model, though debated, still shapes discussion today. This brings us to the link between bell beaker and the spread of Celtic. For a long time, scholars placed Proto-Celtic development around the upper Danube and Rhine, tying it to the Hallstatt and Latène cultures. Now, some specialists propose that Celtic may instead have originated with bell beaker, perhaps even in Iberia. The evidence of Celtic and related Indo-European languages in Iberia makes this suggestion attractive. Yet problems remain. Proto-Celtic developed in contact with early Germanic, something that fits a homeland north of the Alps but not in Iberia. Later links between Celtic and Iranian also make more sense in a Central European setting. Some have argued that the defining sound change of Celtic, the loss of the Indo-European P, could have arisen through contact with Iberian, which lacked that sound. But since Iberian appears to have been a relatively late arrival along the Mediterranean coast, this seems too limited and too late to explain such a fundamental feature of Celtic. Koch's alternative suggestion faces both chronological and geographical issues. Some linguists have argued that Celtic in the British Isles shows influence from Afro-Asiatic languages such as Berber, Coptic, or Semitic. The clearest evidence is thought to be the unusual verb-subject-object VSO word order, a departure from the subject-object-verb SOV, or mixed patterns reconstructed for continental Celtic. Phoenicians, who spoke a Semitic tongue, were present in Iberia by the 8th century BC, and Koch has suggested that they might explain the link. Yet if Phoenician contact were responsible, VSO word order should appear in all Celtic languages, not just in those spoken in Ireland and Britain. A more convincing explanation is that VSO in the Isles arose from interaction with a now-lost pre-Indo-European language spoken by local farming communities before Celtic arrived. Such substrate languages may have shaped syntax in ways that survived long after they themselves disappeared. Berber and Coptic endured in North Africa because Indo-European never displaced them there until modern colonial times, unlike in Europe where older tongues were gradually replaced. Even so, Koch and Cunliffe deserve credit for drawing attention to Iberia, a region often overlooked in Celtic studies. Any serious account of Celtic origins must make sense of the complex linguistic picture in Iberia. A more plausible model is that an Indo-European dialect reached Iberia from Italy with the so-called Stelae people. Too early to be Celtic, while Proto-Celtic itself formed in the traditional zone around the headwaters of the Rhine and Danube. From there, movements during the later Bell-Beaker period could have carried early Celtic dialects into northeastern Iberia, the British Isles, and the Southern Alps. By around 2500 to 2400 BC, Bell-Beaker communities in Iberia were under strain. Violence and upheaval may have driven migration. Some large fortified sites, such as Zambujal, were abandoned. Maritime beaker pottery began appearing in southern France and on the Brittany coast at this time. Distinctive copper spearheads known as palmilla points, originating in Portugal, also spread into Brittany and southern France. Around 2500 BC beaker groups reached Chepel Island on the Danube, near modern Budapest, where finds included a gold disc decorated with concentric circles similar to those found on beaker sites in the West, probably solar symbols. The Chepel group, clustered around Budapest, stood out as newcomers. The heavy presence of horse bones suggests they bred horses, an important draw of the Danube basin. Isotope tests confirmed they were migrants, while inherited dental traits linked them to Western Swiss beaker communities, themselves tied to southern Iberia and southern France. This suggests a return migration of descendants of the Stelae people to the Carpathian Basin. The Eastern beaker world had its own distinct features. Boars' tusks were worn as pendants or garment fasteners, echoing fashions from the steppe. Local ceramic traditions shaped the accompanying pottery, including handled pitchers and polypod cups, which spread outward from Hungary and Slovakia. From there, Eastern beaker influence reached northern Italy, southern France, Sardinia, and the Rhine Valley, where the Rhenish decorative style later developed and was carried into Britain. Beaker groups also established small enclaves across northern Europe, from Jutland to Poland. A dramatic turning point came around 2425 BC at alpine sites such as Sion and Aosta, where earlier beaker stelae were smashed and eastern beaker elements such as boars' tusks appeared. Isotopes from one burial revealed origins far to the east, suggesting that power and influence had shifted from Iberia to Central Europe, particularly the Rhine headwaters. Communities along the Rhone, once oriented towards Iberia, now looked east and north, adopting new pottery designs and ornaments. traces of this Eastern influence even reached Iberia. Around 2200 BC, a new beaker phase began in central Spain, known as the Ciempozuelos horizon. While the pottery retained strong maritime influence, one site produced pedestaled bowls of a type rooted in the Carpathian Basin. This phase may coincide with the arrival of early Proto-Celtic speakers in Iberia, since Celtiberian later emerged as the most archaic Celtic branch. If so, it is plausible that Proto-Celtic took shape during the Bell Beaker era itself. The first beaker settlers in the British Isles may have spoken an earlier Indo-European tongue, with Celtic arriving later via migrations down the Rhine. Around 2400 BC, anthropomorphic stelae were sometimes used to seal older megalithic monuments in Iberia and Brittany, at just the time when beaker groups first reached Ireland. This may reflect ritual farewells to ancestors before departure. Artifacts suggest connections. A gold earring from Benrá in Ireland resembles a pair from Estremoz in Portugal, pointing to maritime contact. Archers' wrist guards also fit this pattern. Narrow, two-hold types common in Iberia are the main form in Ireland, while the broader, four-hold Central European type is absent. This suggests that the first arrivals in Ireland came from Iberia or Brittany. According to this model, the initial beaker migrants to Britain and Ireland spoke an older Western Indo-European tongue, sometimes called Alturopeish, with later migrants introducing early Celtic after 2200 BC. Some scholars argue that the similarity between insular and continental Celtic is too close for such an early divergence, but this assumes the two branches split permanently at that time. In fact, archaeological evidence shows continued contact between Gaul and the Isles, with waves of migration and technological transfer persisting right up to the Roman era. New vocabulary could have spread alongside innovations such as ironworking, explaining the complexity of the relationships between the Celtic languages that were eventually recorded. During the Bronze Age, Celtic-speaking groups across Europe maintained contact with one another through long-distance trade networks. Yet between about 2100 and 1300 BC, the flow of goods and ideas along the Atlantic seaboard dwindled, leaving Iberia relatively cut off from its northern neighbors. Britain and Ireland, meanwhile, remained in closer communication with northwestern France and the Low Countries. A new phase emerged around 1300 BC with the rise of the Atlantic Bronze Age, lasting until about 700 BC. This era was characterized by the circulation of prestigious objects along sea routes linking southern England, Ireland, northwestern France, and northwestern Iberia. At the same time, northwestern Europe was becoming colder and wetter, which may have encouraged migration toward sunnier southern regions. Such movements could help explain the adoption of Celtic languages in northwest Iberia. In this setting, the Castro culture took shape. Beginning in the late Bronze Age and continuing into the Iron Age, it was marked by fortified settlements and a blend of Atlantic and Mediterranean traits. Rather than originating in the far north, its roots seem to lie in northwest Portugal. Cultural currents from Central Europe also reached Iberia at this time. The Urnfield tradition, which spread cremation practices and burial in urns across much of Europe between 1300 and 750 BC, edged into Iberia from the direction of southern France. This culture is often assumed to have been associated with Celtic languages, though early Greek accounts place Ligurians along parts of the French and Iberian coasts, suggesting a more complex picture. Archaeological and linguistic evidence indicates that the Lusitanians, south of the Douro and the Kalichi or Galeci, their northern neighbors, arrived in Iberia during the late Bronze Age. They were not native to the region, and while they displayed some differences, they also shared a set of deities pointing to a common origin. Over time, the Galicians became divided into two zones by the river Minho. In the north, around present-day Lugo, the Lucensis were predominantly Celtic-speaking, while in the south, near modern Braga, the Bracarenses displayed stronger Lusitanian elements. This distribution suggests that Celtic may have entered northwestern Iberia through the trade networks and migrations of the Atlantic Bronze Age. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, criticized the Celts for their reckless bravery, remarking that a man who feared nothing, not even earthquakes or raging seas, must be either mad or numb to pain. To him, such fearlessness was irrational, though it is clear that the Greeks themselves celebrated warrior courage. Their great epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, glorified heroes and the pursuit of honor in battle, and weapons such as swords, shields, and armor were not only sung about, but also buried in graves centuries earlier. The sword, first created in the Bronze Age, was a uniquely human weapon, designed not for hunting or chopping, like bows or axes, but solely for combat. Shields and armor, too, presupposed a society that expected warfare. Early examples were sometimes made of leather or wood, but bronze offered far better protection. Metalworkers cast flat sheets of bronze and hammered them into shape, reheating the metal to keep it workable. Around 1300 BC, at the start of the Urnfield culture in Central Europe, the first real armor appeared. Archaeology has recovered about 120 helmets, nearly 100 shields, over 50 greaves, and a few dozen cuirasses from the Bronze Age, though only in the Carpathian Basin and nearby regions do all types occur together. With the rise of iron, warfare entered a new stage. From the 11th century BC, ecological crisis swept the steppe zones of Europe and Kazakhstan as drought shrank the Black and Caspian Seas and shifted vegetation zones. Farming and mixed economies collapsed, replaced by full nomadism. Out of this turmoil arose the people later remembered as the Cimmerians. Their culture blended Asian steppe elements with influences from the Caucasus and remnants of Western steppe traditions. For them, horse riding became essential. They improved bridles with movable bits designed for mounted control, unlike the rigid designs of the Urnfield world. From 900 BC, their iron weapons and horse gear spread into Central Europe. The Cimmerians carried steppe horses, wagons, and wagon burial customs into the Carpathian Basin, deeply shaping the Hallstatt culture. Linguistically, there may have been interaction as well. Celtic shares a particular sound shift with Iranian that is absent from other Indo-European branches. This could point to contacts between Celtic and Iranian speakers, possibly through Cimmerian intermediaries along the steppe and Danube. The Hallstatt world that emerged was marked by richly furnished wagon burials found in southern Germany, Switzerland, Bohemia, eastern France, and Austria. These graves highlight an elite warrior class who ruled from fortified hilltops. Their power rested on control of long-distance trade. Amber from the Baltic was a prime commodity, identifiable today by chemical analysis. In the early Hallstatt phase, amber moved south through the Danube-Rhone corridor to Italy and Etruria. By the 8th century BC, a new route carried it eastward from the Baltic coast to the Balkans and beyond. In exchange, Hallstatt elites sought luxury imports from the Mediterranean, particularly wine and the vessels used to drink it. One commodity they kept for themselves was the iron sword. Though widely adopted in Hallstatt burials, it spread slowly beyond the region at first. Ironworking, beginning in the 8th century BC, supplemented rather than replaced bronze production, and the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was gradual. Unlike bronze, iron could not be cast. It had to be forged and hammered at high heat, a process demanding greater effort and skill. Yet iron was plentiful, and with it the warrior's sword became the hallmark of power. The best-studied Hallstatt fortress is the Hüneburg in southern Germany, perched above the upper Danube. Its position allowed control over trade routes linking the Baltic, the Rhone, and Italy. Excavations reveal not just a fortified stronghold, but a political and commercial hub. Around 600 BC, its traditional defenses were replaced with Mediterranean-style bastions built of sun-dried brick, likely designed by a southern architect. Further work has uncovered a fortified lower town, bridges, and a massive gatehouse dated to 590 BC. The surrounding farms, protected by palisades, supplied the settlement, giving it an urban character. Goods were made and traded there, but above all, it was a center of political authority. Nearby burials reflect this concentration of power. While many belonged to warrior lords, some graves reveal the rising importance of women in elite society. At Bettelbühl, a richly furnished burial chamber dating to 583 BC held a woman dubbed a Celtic princess, adorned with gold, amber, and bronze treasures. A child buried with her was also given golden ornaments, suggesting that high rank was becoming hereditary. Here, we see the beginnings of aristocracy among the Celts, with wealth, trade, and inherited privilege binding together an emerging noble class. Among the many wagon burials of the Hallstatt world, the grave at Hochdorf is unmatched in its richness and preservation. The burial chamber revealed a tall man of about 40 years of age, dressed in colorful textiles and a conical birch bark hat, much like the one worn by the warrior of Hirschlanden, the earliest life-sized Celtic statue. Most striking were his pointed leather shoes, decorated with gold leaf, which earned him the nickname the Man with the Golden Shoes in a BBC program in 1987. Gold adorned much more than his footwear. He had a gold collar and bracelet, a gold-covered belt, and even a dagger entirely sheathed in gold leaf. Clearly, these were not everyday items, but adornments made for the grandeur of the grave. The chief had been laid on a bronze couch, unique for its time, covered with blankets and decorated with scenes of warriors. Supporting the couch were small wheeled female figures. At the foot of this bier stood an immense bronze cauldron capable of holding around 450 liters of mead, adorned with 3 lions around the rim, creatures unknown to the Celts, but familiar in the Greek world. Analysis suggests it was made by Greek craftsmen in southern Italy. On the opposite side of the chamber rested a 4-wheeled wagon bound with iron, though its nailed-on tires must have made for a rough ride compared with later wheel-fitting techniques. The gold collar at Hochdorf is sometimes mistakenly called a torque, though unlike the true form, it was a solid band large enough to slip over the head and rest on the shoulders, rather than an open ring. Genuine torques, worn tightly around the neck with open ends, are seen on other burials such as the warrior of Hirschlanden and a prominent grave at Hochmichel near the Hüneburg. Another torque-wearing warrior at Saint-Romain-de-Jalionas in France, dating to the 8th century BC, shows that men as well as women wore these ornaments as symbols of status from the very beginnings of the Hallstatt culture. Equally impressive is the burial of the Lady of Vix, discovered in Burgundy, France, near the village of Vix and the commanding hill of Mont-Lassois. Her grave, dating between 500 and 450 BC, is among the richest female burials of early Europe. She lay atop a dismantled wagon, surrounded by extraordinary treasures. Her most famous ornament was a hollow gold torque with ball-shaped terminals set at right angles, decorated with motifs of a lion's paw and a winged horse thought to represent Pegasus. The imagery may have evoked poetic inspiration, highly prized among Celtic elites, though whether that interpretation is accurate remains debated. The Lady of Vix also wore jewelry of coral, amber, lignite, and bronze, but the most spectacular object was the monumental bronze crater placed in her tomb. Standing 1.64 meters high and holding over 1,100 liters, it is the largest surviving vessel of the ancient world. Around its neck march rows of Greek warriors and chariots, confirming its origin in the Mediterranean, likely from the same workshop as the Hochdorf cauldron. The presence of such wealth has long raised questions about her role. Some wondered if she was a priestess, others if she was a ruler in her own right, as women could inherit authority in certain circumstances, much like Boudica centuries later. Later discoveries shed further light. In 1991, aerial surveys revealed a square sacred precinct near her burial, where two headless statues were found, one of a warrior, the other of a woman wearing a torque identical to hers. This pairing suggests that the Lady of Vix and a male consort were dynastic founders whose memory was ritually honored. Yet around 450 BC, their images were deliberately decapitated, and Mont-Lassois itself lost its prominence, marking a dramatic shift in local power. The fortified hilltop of Glauberg in Hesse, Germany, offers an excellent glimpse into a late Hallstatt and early Latin princely center, dating between the 6th and 4th centuries BC. Much like the Heuneberg, it combined a stronghold on the summit with farms and elite burials on the surrounding slopes. In 1996, archaeologists uncovered a nearly complete sandstone statue beside one of the burial mounds, soon called the Glauberg Prince. The figure wore a distinctive leaf-shaped crown, reminiscent of the laurel wreaths later awarded to Roman emperors. Other statues and depictions from the Hallstatt world feature similar headgear, suggesting a wider tradition of symbolic regalia. The mound next to the statue had already been excavated and revealed the untouched burial of a man in his 20s. The grave goods made it clear that the statue was a portrait of this prince, since he had been buried with a magnificent gold torque identical to the one carved on the figure, along with matching arm rings and a finger ring. Even traces of his leaf crown survived. Alongside this jewelry, he was buried with warrior equipment, including an iron sword, spearheads, a quiver of arrows, and a shield. Scientific studies of his remains showed he had lived on a rich diet with abundant animal protein, unlike the poorer individuals buried nearby in shallow pits, whose skeletons displayed signs of heavy labor and diets based mainly on millet. Some scholars even wondered if these less formal burials might represent slaves. Whether that is true or not, the stark contrast between the prince and his neighbors highlights the growing divide between elite and commoner. The Glauberg statue, like the warrior of Hirschlanden, shows the skill of early Celtic sculptors, but does not reach the naturalism of Greek art. The legs are lifelike, but the sculptor left the upper body solid, avoiding fragile gaps that could break. This style recalls the older anthropomorphic stele of the Copper Age, though the time gap is too great to claim direct continuity. Meanwhile, the Gola Secca culture in northern Italy served as a bridge between the Hallstatt world and the Etruscans. Here, Celtic-speaking communities encountered writing and adapted the Etruscan alphabet to record their own language, leaving around 140 inscriptions between the 6th century BC and the turn of the millennium. Modern scholars call this language Lepontic, after the Lepanti people recorded in later Roman and Greek sources. Ancient writers placed them around the sources of the Rhone, the Rhine, and the Ticino, in the valleys of the Gotthard Massif and beyond. These passes, though treacherous in antiquity, connected northern Italy with Central Europe and allowed Gola Secca communities to thrive on long-distance trade. The Gola Secca culture began in the 8th century BC, but its roots reach back to a branch of the Urnfield culture that arrived in northern Italy during the 13th century BC. This migration is thought to have carried the earliest Celtic language into the region, long before the better-known Gallic expansions of the 4th century BC. Yet even earlier influences may have reached the Alps through bell-beaker groups at Sion and Aosta, which saw a sudden influx of Eastern beaker traditions around 2400 BC. If so, Celtic could have reached the Southern Alps in stages, maintained through continuous trade and movement across the mountain passes. Still, Lepontic is best seen as a distinct Celtic language, not simply a dialect of Gaulish. The evolution of Celtic languages is marked by notable sound shifts, the most famous being the change from *kw to *p. For instance, the Proto-Indo-European word *ekwos for horse became equos in early Celtic, which survives in Old Irish ek, but in Gaulish it shifted to epo, preserved in the horse goddess Epona. The Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet from Gaul, still shows equos as a month name, though most Gaulish inscriptions use the p form. This shift, however, was uneven, as older forms like Sequana for the Seine survived alongside newer names such as Epidi in Britain and Menapi in Gaul. Traditionally, Celtic has been divided into two groups: P-Celtic, which includes Gaulish and Brittonic, and Q-Celtic, which includes Irish. But some linguists argue that the more important distinction is between continental and insular Celtic. Continental languages such as Gaulish and Lepontic died out by the end of the Roman era, while insular Celtic, Welsh, Irish, and Breton continued to evolve for centuries. Their long development means that comparisons with their ancient cousins must be made cautiously. The earliest Celtic in the British Isles was likely Proto-Celtic, which diverged gradually as it spread. Later movements from Gaul in the Latèan period reinforced the similarities between Brittonic and Gaulish. Ongoing contact across the seas kept links between Ireland and Britain strong, helping to explain why insular Celtic languages retained so many shared features even as they branched into distinct traditions. There was no sudden divide between the Hallstatt and Latène worlds. Rather, one flowed naturally into the other. Sites such as Glauberg continued seamlessly from the late Hallstatt into the early Latène period, and even at Hallstatt itself, burials of the new era appear alongside earlier traditions. Still, by around 450 BC, there are hints of upheaval. Mont-la-Soie was deserted, and the great stronghold of the Huneberg was also abandoned without a clear explanation. At the same time, new power centers emerged further north along the edge of the old Hallstatt zone, particularly around the Moselle and Marne rivers and in Bohemia. These regions held strategic advantages. They combined navigable waterways with iron ore and forest resources essential for charcoal production in ironworking. The Moselle, a tributary of the Rhine already familiar to Celtic groups, had wagon burials during the Hallstatt era. In the La Tène period, these gave way to chariot groves, clustered along the Moselle, the Middle Rhine, and most heavily around the Marne and Oise valleys near modern Reims. In Bohemia, similar burials appear along the river Vltava, the longest river of today's Czech Republic and a major Celtic trade route. The chariot quickly became a potent symbol of Celtic aristocracy, alongside gold torques, fine weaponry, and imported wine. Instead of imposing burial mounds, flat graves became common, with men buried with weapons and women with jewelry. In warfare, the chariot itself was transformed into a formidable weapon, deployed with skill on the battlefield. Chariot building came relatively late to the Celts. While Greek artisans depicted chariots with 4-spoke wheels on objects like the Vix crater, the Celts were still burying wagons. Celtic chariot graves begin in the 5th century BC. Usually, the wooden structures of these vehicles have rotted away, leaving only metal fittings. Yet at the lakeside site of La Tène, exceptional preservation in mud revealed wooden yokes, a wheel, and iron fittings, including cotters, pins used to secure moving parts, hinting at a suspension system. To test how such a vehicle might have worked, Swiss archaeologist Andres Furger-Gunti commissioned a reconstruction. He proposed a suspension design with sidearms curving upward and backward from the pole, supporting the cotters beneath the platform. The result was a functioning chariot, later confirmed by early Irish sources that described a similar design. Modern linguistic studies of Irish chariot terms also support this conclusion. The Celts, however, were not solely warriors and charioteers. Their La Tène culture also saw an artistic renaissance. Contact with the Mediterranean introduced classical motifs, while echoes of Scythian art may also have influenced Celtic styles. But Celtic artisans did not merely imitate, they developed their own bold vision. Earlier curvilinear designs, already visible in Hallstatt art, evolved into freer and more imaginative forms. Plant motifs transformed into animal heads or abstract spirals. Horses were rendered in flowing lines that suggested both grace and strangeness, sometimes recalling creatures of the sea. Celtic art consciously diverged from the classical pursuit of lifelike realism. This contrast is striking in 2 famous pieces: the Greek statue of the dying Gaul and a stylized Celtic head from Bohemia. Both figures wear torques and mustaches, marking them as Celtic, but their artistic treatment could not be more different. The dying Gaul conveys human pain and vulnerability, while the Bohemian head, with its exaggerated almond eyes, curling brows, and lotus-shaped ears, projects an otherworldly presence. It represents pride and identity, but sets its subject apart from ordinary humanity, embodying the unique vision of Celtic art. By the 2nd century BC, Celtic communities had begun creating towns of their own. Julius Caesar referred to these large settlements as oppida during his campaigns, borrowing a Latin word used in Italy for civic centers. He clearly recognized them as tribal hubs of trade and administration in Gaul. Debate has long persisted over whether these places were genuine towns in the modern sense, since archaeology has sometimes used the term too broadly for any fortified site of the late La Tène age. Not every fort was a town, and not every town was fortified. What truly defines urban life is evidence of commerce, craft production, and governance. Features like coin minting or communal buildings. Some of these Celtic settlements evolved into Roman or modern cities, while others vanished before Rome's dominance. Many grew out of hill forts, while others were established in lowlands, always strategically placed on rivers or coasts to facilitate trade. One prime example is Zavist, near present-day Prague, built on a defensible hill overlooking the Vltava River. This became the capital of the Boii, whose name survives in Bohemia. Founded in the 2nd century BC, Zavist expanded through several phases to nearly 300 acres. But by the late 1st century BC, it was abandoned as Germanic tribes pressed into the region. The Boii migrated westward, leaving traces in Bavaria at Manching and at Passau, once known as Boioduron, the fortified place of the Boii. Manching itself dwarfed Zavist. At nearly 940 acres, it was one of the largest known Celtic oppida. Located on a flood-free terrace near the Danube, it thrived as a center of trade and manufacturing. Iron smelting dominated the surrounding countryside, and within the town, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of extensive metalworking alongside tools for textiles and leatherwork. Streets, squares, religious sanctuaries, and commercial areas suggest an organized urban landscape. Interestingly, defense was not a primary concern in its early days. Walls were not constructed until about 120 BC. Yet despite its size and sophistication, Manching too was abandoned by around 50 BC, just before the Roman advance into the region. The broader question remains: were these flourishing centers a sign of Celtic strength and ambition to expand, or were they the product of a culture under stress, pushing out migrants as conditions worsened? Ancient writers certainly remembered the migrations. Pompeius Trogus, a Romanized Gaul writing in the 1st century BC, described a massive outpouring of people caused by overpopulation, with some marching into Italy and even burning Rome in 390 BC, while others pressed into Illyricum. These dramatic incursions, seared into Roman memory, helped fuel the Republic's later drive for conquest and security. The attack on Delphi in Greece by Celtic warbands in the 3rd century BC likewise left an indelible mark on Mediterranean history. Elsewhere, Celtic movements are harder to trace, relying mainly on material culture and place names. Pressures from Germanic expansion east of the Rhine displaced Celtic-speaking groups, remembered in Gaulish tradition as refugees forced from their lands by war and rising seas. Caesar identified these groups as Belgae, originally from across the Rhine, whose culture and names were nonetheless Celtic. Flooding along the subsiding North Sea coast likely drove both Germanic and Celtic peoples inland, setting off waves of migration. The Belgae displaced older Gaulish tribes, such as the Parisii, whose chariot burials shifted westward under this pressure. Similar patterns may explain why Ptolemy later recorded Parisii in Britain. Other movements were tied to climate and opportunity. By 400 BC, a cooling climate reduced the viability of marginal farmland, forcing migrations southward into Italy. Ancient historians offered colorful explanations. Livy recounted traditions of overpopulation, with Gallic king Ambigatus sending settlers to relieve pressure, while other tales spoke of Gauls, lured by Italy's fruits, oil, and wine. Pliny the Elder repeated a version where trade tempted northern tribes with Mediterranean luxuries, turning curiosity into colonization. Archaeological finds confirm these stories of attraction. Wine jars from the Mediterranean became increasingly common in Gaul and Britain before the Roman conquest. Thus, a combination of population pressures, environmental changes, Germanic encroachment, and the lure of Mediterranean wealth all played roles in the great Celtic migrations. These movements reshaped Europe, bringing Celts into lasting contact and often conflict with Rome, Greece, and beyond. Through the cultural channel of Gaula Secca, Celtic groups had ample opportunity to study the political landscape of northern Italy before they displaced the Etruscans from the fertile Po Valley around 400 BC. This is exactly how Polybius, a Greek historian born around 200 BC, described the situation. Known for his commitment to first-hand evidence and a sober pursuit of truth, Polybius explained that the Celts, tempted by the richness of the land, invaded under a flimsy pretext, driving out the Etruscans and dividing the territory among themselves. Different Celtic tribes settled specific regions: the Livii and Libichor near the river's source, the powerful Insubres in the center, the Cenomani alongside them, and across the Po, the Anares, Boii, Lingones, and Senones. Rome itself was not the initial target. The disaster that befell the city in 390 BC, when it was captured and plundered, came only after Celtic activity spread south to Clusium. The Etruscans had built cities, but what the Gauls wanted was farmland. Many urban centers fell into decline or were occupied only on a smaller scale. Polybius even remarked that Celtic villages were unwalled and lacked urban amenities. When names like Mediolanum, Milan, Brixia, Brescia, or Verona appear, they should not conjure images of sophisticated cities, but rather of tribal hubs with strong agricultural foundations. Even so, archaeology confirms that the Celts brought their own traditions of craftsmanship. Milan itself has revealed extensive Iron Age metalworking sites, some linked to Latine culture. The newcomers also adopted the Lepontic script to inscribe their language, giving us evidence of Cisalpine Gaulish. At roughly the same time, the Boii were expanding eastward into Moravia, Slovakia, and Austria, establishing themselves in the Carpathian Basin. From here, the river Sava led south to the Adriatic, providing a natural trade corridor that connected them with Celtic groups in the Alps. Evidence of Latin artifacts in the Balkans, especially around the Danube, confirms these movements. The Scordisci, a Celtic people who emerged from these migrations, established their stronghold at Singidunum, modern Belgrade, a commanding position at the confluence of the Sava and the Danube. Greek accounts even preserve a tale of Celtic trickery against the Illyrians. Leaving poisoned food and wine in their abandoned camp, they returned when their enemies were struck down by illness and slaughtered them with ease. These developments placed Celts in contact with Macedonia. Philip II had expelled Illyrians from the northwest in 358 BC, and Celtic groups pressing into the region may have seen him as an ally. Although we have no record of him employing them as mercenaries, his coinage circulated widely and was imitated by both Boii and Scordisci in some of the earliest Celtic minting. After his death, ambassadors from Adriatic Celts approached his son Alexander, who famously asked them what they feared most. Expecting their answer to be himself, he was surprised when they declared they feared nothing but the sky falling. This response, reflecting their reverence for natural forces and a sky god, was probably misunderstood by the young conqueror. The Celtic connection with Macedonia endured until Alexander's death in 323 BC. His empire quickly fragmented, leaving the Balkans exposed to further Celtic incursions. By 310 BC, they were pushing deeper into Illyria. Political instability in Macedonia after the death of Cassander in 297 BC provided the opening for major Celtic invasions. In 281 BC, a Celtic leader named Bulgios killed the Macedonian king in battle, only to be checked by a general named Sosthenes. Soon after, another commander, Brenos, led a massive army southward, plundering Macedonia and advancing into Greece. His attempt to sack Delphi ended in catastrophe when natural disasters struck, followed by infighting and a desperate retreat. Wounded, Brenos killed himself, and Greek accounts claimed none of his men survived. Later writers, like Athenaeus in the 2nd century AD, believed that survivors of Delphi formed the Skordishi and other Balkan Celtic groups. In reality, the Celtic presence in southeastern Europe had begun before this dramatic episode, though the events of 280 to 279 BC likely swelled their ranks with new arrivals. The Celts who moved into Thrace carved out a kingdom that extorted tribute from Byzantium until they were destroyed in 212 BC. Yet some crossed into Asia Minor when King Nicomedes of Bithynia hired them as mercenaries to secure his throne. After their service ended, they roamed Anatolia, demanding tribute until Attalus I of Pergamon finally defeated them. These groups became known as the Galatians, establishing themselves in central Anatolia around modern Ankara. Though Strabo later linked them to the Tectosagi of Gaul because of the shared name, it is more plausible that they were migrants from east of the Rhine. Their very name, meaning seekers of new lands, perfectly suits the restless Celtic bands who, by the early 3rd century BC, had spread from the Po Valley to the Balkans and Asia Minor, reshaping the ancient world in their wake. Strabo records that the Galatians held their annual assemblies at a site called Drunemeton, meaning sacred place of oaks. This alone shows their Celtic identity, for Dru refers to the oak, the root of the word druid, while Nemeton was a sacred enclosure found in many Celtic place names and religious contexts. Galatia remained an independent kingdom until it was absorbed into the Roman Empire, and its proximity to Jerusalem made it part of the earliest Christian missionary efforts. Paul visited the region during his 2nd journey and later wrote his epistle to the Galatians. Centuries afterward, Jerome noted that their language was strikingly similar to that of the Treveri of Trier, among whom he had studied. This supports the view that the Belgae spoke Gaulish, since the Galatian language appears as Gaulish with strong Greek influences. The question of how Celtic speakers reached Iberia has long challenged historians. There are limited traces of direct Central European influence, suggesting instead that the earliest Celtic layer in the peninsula may have arrived around 2200 BC, with late Bell Beaker groups crossing the Pyrenees into the Central Plateau, giving rise to what later emerged as Celtiberian. In the northwest, contacts with Atlantic Europe between 1300 and 700 BC may have introduced Celtic elements to Galicia. By Roman times, Celtic place names were widespread across Iberia. Those ending in Brega, hill fort, or high place, are especially prominent. While many are found in regions associated with the Lusitanian language, the linguistic evidence shows that Briga is uniquely Celtic, transforming the vocalic R into RAE. Thus, even where the first part of a name comes from a pre-Celtic root, the addition of Briga reveals Celtic naming practices imposed on older settlements. The spread of Celtiberian artifacts into western and southwestern Iberia suggests westward expansion long before Roman conquest. A Celtiberian-style mint was active in ancient Lusitania, and Pliny believed that the Celtici of southern Spain were descended from Celtiberians who had moved southward. Strabo likewise claimed that the Celts of the Guadiana Valley were related to those in Galicia, and inscriptions to shared deities support this connection. In Roman times, individuals from Celtiberia are recorded as settling in these regions, leaving traces of migration. A later wave of Celtic newcomers were Gauls, though their overall impact is harder to measure. Some Iberian place names ending in -dunum suggest a Gaulish presence, though the suffix itself was common to Celtic languages generally. More concrete are names such as Forum Gallorum, Gallicum, and Gallica Flavia, which mark settlements of Gaulish groups, especially in Aragon, pointing to crossings of the Pyrenees. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Latin culture spread into Britain not long after it took root on the continent. While some scholars have emphasized trade, the close linguistic ties between Gaulish and Brittonic make migration almost certain. Environmental shifts likely played a role. Between 650 and 450 BC, warm and dry conditions allowed population growth on the continent, creating pressure for new lands. Around 400 BC, Britain, benefiting from improved conditions, became an attractive destination. Ireland, by contrast, was declining. After reaching a peak of productivity in the late Bronze Age, signs of occupation dwindled through the early Iron Age. Poverty and a falling population were the result of worsening climate, along with the loss of Ireland's former advantage in metals as bronze technology spread widely. Even its supplies of tin and gold may have dwindled. By 800 BC, cooler, wetter weather was making farming more difficult, leaving Ireland in relative isolation compared to its neighbors. Around 400 BC, Ireland experienced a marked rise in activity that lasted with relative stability until the close of the millennium. This may reflect population growth encouraged by a warmer and drier climate. By about 300 BC, the first Latin objects began to appear in Ireland, a development that coincides with this favorable shift in conditions. The earliest imported metalwork shows strong continental parallels, though this does not mean they came directly from mainland Europe. More likely, groups entering Britain from Gaul carried prized possessions with them, which later generations may have taken on to Ireland. The concentration of Latin material in the northern and central parts of the island has led to the view that it entered Ireland through northern Britain. A decisive clue comes from the study of beehive quern stones. Decorated examples in Ireland match those from Yorkshire and southern Scotland, strengthening the case for migration from that region. If earlier arrivals from Gaul had already spread the well-known P-Celtic sound shift into Britain, then migrants crossing from Britain to Ireland would have carried it with them. Evidence suggests this was indeed the case. By the time Ptolemy composed his geography in the 2nd century AD, both Gaelic and Brittonic tribal and place names could be found in Ireland. Not all the Brittonic names need date from as far back as 300 BC, since the Roman conquest of Britain later pushed some groups westward across the Irish Sea. Ptolemy's map of Ireland does not reflect the older native division into 5 provinces, but a few names connect to known traditions. The Ooluntioi in the northeast correspond to the later Ulaid of Ulster, while the Iwerni in the south appear in later tradition as the Erain, ruling dynasties in Munster before the 7th century AD. Earlier Greek sources describe the Iwerni as the people of all Ireland, suggesting that they had been gradually pushed southwards since the Latin migrations. In the centuries before the Roman conquest, Britain itself faced waves of newcomers. From the 2nd century BC, raids by Belgic tribes from Gaul turned into settlement along Britain's southern and eastern coasts. Caesar noted in 54 BC that many Belgic groups had crossed the Channel, retaining the same tribal names as their kin in Gaul. Archaeological evidence supports this, particularly from the spread of Gallo-Belgic coinage in southeastern Britain from about 125 BC onward. Large fortified lowland centers appeared, resembling those in Gaul, housing craftsmen skilled in wheel-thrown pottery and coin minting, the first in Britain. These coins, along with settlement patterns, reveal tribal identities and territories. The Atrebates, for instance, established their center at Caliva, modern Silchester, sharing their name with a Belgic tribe from northern France. North of them lived the Catuvellauni, whose capital was Verolamion, St. Albans. Their name also echoes a smaller group in Gaul, who gave their name to Catalonum, Chalons-sur-Marne. Archaeological finds link the Aylesford swarling culture in Britain with Belgic traditions on the continent, visible among the Catuvellani, the Trinovantes at Camulodonon, the Colchester, and the Cantiaci of Kent. These shared traits confirm that these groups were part of the Belgic influx into Britain. It was they who bore the first brunt of Rome's advance into the island. Is there anyone so indifferent or incurious that he would not wish to understand how, and under what system, the Romans were able to conquer almost the entire known world in little more than half a century? So asked Polybius, writing before Rome's armies pushed into Gaul and Britain. For him, the known world was the Mediterranean basin, yet by the 2nd century AD, the empire encompassed nearly all Celtic-speaking peoples of Europe and Asia, save for those of Ireland and the far north of Britain. It was a remarkable achievement, and even more striking for its endurance over centuries. The first victims of Rome's rise were the Cisalpine Gauls. Polybius, drawing on events within living memory, describes how the Senones were expelled in 295 BC and their lands seized for Roman colonists. The Boii, fearing the same, allied with the Etruscans, but were defeated. A fragile peace followed for 45 years until a younger generation, unscarred by past losses, rallied the Insubres and called on allies from across the Alps to march against Rome. They were finally subdued between 224 and 226 BC, while the Cenomani sided with the Romans. The balance seemed to shift with the outbreak of the Second Punic War. For the Gauls of northern Italy, Carthage appeared a stronger ally than Rome, and Hannibal knew how to exploit their resentment. With elephants and a vast army, he crossed the Alps, guided by Cisalpine Gauls, and in 217 BC, crushed a Roman army at Lake Trasimene. For a moment, Rome's destruction seemed possible. Yet while Hannibal triumphed in Italy, Rome undermined Carthage abroad, cutting off its resources in Iberia and North Africa. Scipio Africanus's victories there forced Hannibal home, where Carthage ultimately sued for peace. The defeat left the Gauls vulnerable. In the years that followed, the Insubres, Boii, and Cenomani were stripped of power and reduced to dependent allies. Yet Rome preferred not to drive them out entirely, finding it more practical to leave pacified tribes in charge of their own land under Roman oversight. Over time, these peoples were drawn into the Roman system, and Milan grew into a thriving commercial hub. Spain became Rome's next great battlefield. Its conquest began as a defensive response in 218 BC and concluded with Augustus' campaigns 2 centuries later. When Hannibal besieged Saguntum, a prosperous Iberian trading town allied with Rome, The city's desperate appeals brought legates but no army. Hannibal took it, and Rome had its justification for war. Roman generals Gnaeus and Publius Scipio landed in Iberia, aided by the daring defection of Abelix, an Iberian noble who rescued hostages from Carthaginian control and delivered them back to their families with Roman blessing. This gesture won allies across the peninsula. The tide turned with the arrival of young Publius Cornelius Scipio, later surnamed Africanus. In 209 BC, he struck at Carthage's power base in Spain by seizing Cartagena. Once again, he restored hostages to their people, securing loyalty through clemency as much as conquest. From there, the Romans pressed their advantage, driving Carthaginian forces from Spain. Rome's presence could not simply be withdrawn. Garrisons remained, and with them came new policies. Resistance was met with enslavement, feeding Rome's growing demand for labor, while collaboration was rewarded with autonomy or even freedom. Prisoners of war, once reduced to slaves, might find themselves generations later absorbed into Roman households, their origins forgotten. Yet opposition was fierce. The Lusitanian shepherd warrior Viriatus rose from bandit leader to military commander in the 140s BC. Hardened by a rugged life, he proved a brilliant strategist, winning repeated victories against Rome until betrayed and murdered by his own men at Roman instigation. His legend endured in Iberian memory as a symbol of defiance. By the 1st century BC, Roman control expanded steadily. Julius Caesar, as governor of Hispania from 62 to 60 BC, campaigned into the far northwest, defeating the Galaici and Lusitani. In these battles, his soldiers first hailed him as Imperator, a title of honor for victorious generals, an omen of the imperial legacy that his successors would claim. At the time when Caesar was preparing to enter the stage of history, both the Romans and the Gauls were undergoing political change. Among the Gallic tribes, kings still held sway in many places, yet in others, hereditary rule had been replaced with systems that echoed Roman models of shared authority. Rome itself had abandoned monarchy centuries before, replacing it with elected officials. In moments of crisis, however, they could still appoint a dictator with sweeping powers, though only for a limited time. Not long after his campaigns in Gaul, Caesar himself would be granted powers that made him appear almost like a king in all but name. In 59 BC, he achieved one of the highest offices of the Roman state by being elected consul, a position held by 2 men at a time for just 1 year. When a consul's term ended, it was customary to grant him a governorship in the provinces, a reward that brought wealth and influence. Caesar received the governorship of Roman Gaul, along with Illyricum. At this point, Rome already controlled Cisalpine Gaul and the province of Gallia Narbonensis, which provided a land corridor for troops moving between Italy and Spain. Caesar had no explicit mandate to conquer the rest of Gaul, but he would have known well the glory and power awaiting a general who achieved such a feat. With its fertile soils, ample sunshine, and abundant rivers, Gaul was a land rich in promise. All that was needed was a pretext, and soon 2 of them appeared, the movements of the Helvetii and the pleas of the Aedui. The Helvetii, a formidable tribe dwelling in what is now Switzerland, had long been under pressure from the advancing Germanic peoples. After decades of strain, they decided to abandon their homeland altogether and seek new lands to settle, even to dominate the rest of Gaul. Their plans ripened just as Caesar began his governorship. Joined by other Celtic groups, including a remnant of the wandering Boii, they formed a large migrating horde. Their chosen path led straight through the Roman province in southern Gaul. Caesar hurried to Geneva, where he destroyed the bridge across the Rhone to block their advance. Although Roman engineers are often remembered as the bringers of roads and bridges, Gaul itself already possessed established routes and crossing points. Caesar even encountered roads when he reached Britain, and medieval Irish law codes would later make provisions for public roads in a land never taken by Rome. What Roman builders perfected, however, was a system of paved highways and durable stone bridges that could withstand heavy traffic and allow legions to march swiftly across great distances. Confronted at Geneva, the Helvetii altered their route, but Caesar pursued them relentlessly, forcing them to retreat and return to their original lands. In doing so, he ensured they remained in place as a buffer between the Germanic tribes and Roman territory. This display of Roman strength was not lost on the other Gallic peoples, who now saw Rome as a power capable of both blocking threats and reshaping the balance of Gaulish politics. At the same time, the Aedui, long allies of Rome, were entangled in rivalry with their neighbors, the Arverni and the Sequani. The Aedui, whose capital was Bibracte in central France, had once been dominant. The Sequani, however, controlled traffic along the Saône River, and disputes over tolls sparked violent conflict. In desperation, the Arverni and Sequani made a fateful decision. They invited Germanic warriors to fight as mercenaries. This brought them victory over the Aedui in 61 BC, but the triumph proved short-lived. Their leader Ariovistus seized a third of Sequani land for himself, lured more of his countrymen into Gaul, and demanded further territory. The prosperity and fertile farmlands of Gaul, so superior to the harsh conditions of Germania, drew these newcomers in like a magnet, transforming hired soldiers into permanent conquerors. When Caesar entered Gaul in 58 BC, he soon found himself called upon to act. Both the Aedui and their former rivals appealed to him for assistance against the growing menace of Germanic settlement under Ariovistus. Caesar had reason enough. Not only did Gauls fear losing their land, but Romans feared that once the Germani dominated Gaul, the path into Roman territory, and even Italy, would lie open. So Caesar marched to drive Ariovistus back across the Rhine. Yet not all Gauls were pleased at the arrival of Roman protection. Whispers soon spread that the Belgae were preparing resistance. According to Caesar, they feared that if Rome subdued all of Gaul, they would be next. Their roots east of the Rhine made them doubtless wary of being cast out with the Germani settlers. By 57 BC, Caesar had raised his army to 8 legions, nearly 48,000 men, while the Belgic coalition, together with Germanic allies, claimed almost 300,000. Even if the numbers were exaggerated, the Romans were heavily outnumbered. Caesar avoided a pitched battle, wearing down the coalition with constant skirmishes. Such a vast army could not be kept in the field without food, and once supplies ran short, the tribes dispersed. This gave Caesar the chance to break them apart, defeating each in turn. By the end of that year, he could claim Gaul as pacified, though rebellion flared up time and again. The most serious revolt erupted in 52 BC, under the leadership of Vercingetorix of the Arverni. His father had once sought kingship over all Gaul and paid with his life, but the son revived the vision. Though expelled at first by his elders, he gathered followers, reclaimed power, and rallied much of Gaul to his side. His victory at Gergovia was remembered for centuries, but his eventual defeat at Alesia made him a tragic figure. Facing certain destruction, he told his men that he had fought not for his own ambition, but for the freedom of Gaul, and surrendered himself to Caesar. Clad in his finest armor, he rode forth, dismounted, stripped off his weapons, and placed himself at Caesar's feet. He was later paraded through Rome and executed, yet his defiance endured in memory. Caesar also cast his eyes across the Channel. He justified an expedition to Britain by claiming that its tribes had repeatedly sent aid to Gaul. In 55 BC, he attempted a crossing late in the season, but storms and fierce resistance forced him back. The next year he returned with greater numbers, facing a united defense under Cassivellaunos, the king of the Catuvelauni. Yet division among the tribes worked in Caesar's favor. The Trinovantes and others sided with Rome, while Caesar pressed Cassivellaunos until he submitted. Caesar did not garrison Britain, but he took hostages and demanded tribute, content to have displayed Rome's reach. Almost a century later, Claudius, newly emperor, ordered a full conquest. In AD 43, an army of 4 legions under Aulus Plautius crossed the Channel, with Vespasian commanding 1 legion that fought hard in the southwest. Riches of silver, lead, and tin made the island worth subjugating. The expansion was gradual, tribe by tribe. Some leaders, like Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes, allied with Rome. Others, like Caraticos, resisted until captured. Caraticos, brought in chains to Rome, impressed Claudius with his bold words and won pardon, though his resistance had ended. The Romans ruled through a mix of force and accommodation. Tribal centers became Roman towns, client kings ruled under imperial oversight, and native elites were drawn into the Roman order. Towns such as Caliva Atrebatum grew from earlier oppida, while palaces like that at Fishbourne proclaimed the wealth of local rulers allied to Rome. As Tacitus later remarked with scorn, Rome's genius was to bind even kings in service to its empire, turning leaders into instruments of subjugation. Roman knowledge of the Celtic peoples living beyond Hadrian's Wall was limited and often vague. Ptolemy, writing around AD 150, listed several tribal names from this region, though most of them vanish from history soon after. One group that does reappear is the Caledoni. Based on his description, they occupied the Great Glen around Loch Ness and the highlands stretching south to the Firth of Clyde. Their name lived on in the 9th century settlement of Dunkeld, once known as Dun Cheldon, meaning Fort of the Caledoni. In time, their reputation as fierce opponents of Rome became so strong that the name Caledonia was used by the Romans for all the lands north of their frontier. By AD 208, tribes north of the Roman border were raiding Roman Britain with destructive force. The Emperor Septimius Severus personally led a campaign to contain them. Herodian wrote that these northern Britons went without clothing, so their elaborate tattoos of animals and intricate patterns would remain visible. Cassius Dio noted that 2 major groups stood out: the Caledonians and the Maeotians. The Maeotians lived near the Roman defensive wall cutting across Britain, while the Caledonians were further north. Both historians referred to them as Britons, but in this context, the term meant only those tribes outside the empire. The Maeotians, or Maeathi in Brittonic, are absent from Ptolemy's earlier work and may represent new tribal formations after the Roman campaigns of Agricola. Place names preserve their memory. Dumyat in the Ochil Hills near Stirling comes from Dun Meathi, fort of the Maeathi, and Myothil near Falkirk also appears linked to them. Later, in AD 305, Constantius Chlorus claimed a victory over the Caledones and other Picts. This marks the first recorded use of the term picti, meaning painted in Latin, a Roman label for all tribes north of the frontier. Isidore of Seville later explained that this referred to tattoos made with plant dyes. Earlier, Roman writers had described the Britons' use of woad, which left their skin blue. Over time, as the Britons inside the empire adopted Roman customs, those beyond the border remained recognizable by their body art. Around the same period, the Romans also began using the name Scoti for the people of Ireland. In later centuries, Christian writers in Britain and Ireland adopted these Latin terms when describing their neighbors. Eventually, the name Scot became attached specifically to those Irish settlers who established dominance in the lands once held by the Picts, giving rise to the Kingdom of Scotland. In AD 367, Britannia was struck by a coordinated assault, remembered as the Barbarian Conspiracy. Picts, Saxons, Scots, and Atticoti launched attacks from different directions, devastating towns, seizing captives, and carrying off livestock. One Roman commander was killed, another captured, and the province was thrown into chaos until the Emperor Valentinian I dispatched the general Theodosius, who restored order with a strong force. This turmoil foreshadowed the greater upheavals that followed Rome's withdrawal from Britain in AD 410. By the time the Western Roman Empire fragmented, Latin had become so dominant among the literate classes that the earliest surviving writings from the British Isles are in that language. St. Patrick, a Briton writing from Ireland, used Latin, as did the Briton Gildas, who condemned the sins of his people and described Saxon, Pictish, and Irish raids as divine punishment. Latin was firmly tied to Christianity, which had taken root across the empire. Yet the rulers Gildas criticized bore Celtic names, and Patrick himself admitted that Latin was not his native tongue. This reveals how Britain diverged from Gaul and Iberia, where Celtic languages disappeared entirely and Romance tongues eventually developed. Christianity had long been a minority faith within the empire, often clashing with Roman expectations of loyalty to the deified emperor. Periodic persecutions targeted Christians, with St. Alban remembered as Britain's first martyr. His execution at Verulamium led to the modern city of St. Albans, bearing his name. After a respite from persecution beginning in 260, Christianity gained ground until Diocletian's great persecution in 303. By then it was too deeply rooted to be destroyed. The Edict of Toleration in 311 acknowledged its survival, and Constantine later gave the faith official recognition. By 314, bishops from York, London, and Lincoln attended the Council of Arles in Gaul, demonstrating the existence of an organized church in Britain. The blending of old and new beliefs is seen in a curious offering made by a man named Annianus in the sacred spring at Bath. On a lead tablet, he appealed to the goddess Sulis to recover stolen coins, whether taken by pagan or Christian. The wording shows he was familiar with Christian terminology, yet he still invoked a traditional deity. This illustrates how older religious practices lingered even as Christianity spread. One of the most remarkable figures of late Roman Britain was Pelagius, born around the mid-4th century. A Christian moralist, he emphasized simple, virtuous living and taught that salvation could be achieved through good deeds. Moving to Rome after Christianity became the empire's official religion in 380, he gained followers but clashed with Saint Augustine and Saint Jerome, who accused him of diminishing divine grace. Declared a heretic, his teachings still spread widely in Britain, leading Pope Celestine to send Saint Germanus of Auxerre in 429 to oppose Pelagianism. When Britain ceased to be part of the Roman Empire in 410, Christianity was firmly established. Patrick's writings suggest that many Britons were indifferent in their faith, but he himself grew up in a Christian household. He was later enslaved by Irish raiders, which may have inadvertently carried the religion across the sea. Other Britons also migrated voluntarily to Ireland. By 431, there were enough converts for the Pope to send Palladius as the island's first bishop. The earliest form of the Gaelic languages, known as Primitive Irish, is preserved only in Ogham inscriptions. The Irish were familiar with the Latin alphabet through centuries of contact with Rome, but instead of adapting it, they devised their own script. Ogham consisted of strokes cut along or across a line, resembling tally marks, tailored to the sounds of Irish speech. Notably, it lacked a symbol for the letter P by. These inscriptions, mainly dating from the 4th to 6th centuries, are found in Ireland and parts of Western Britain, with the highest concentration in counties Kerry, Cork, and Waterford. Most Ogham stones are memorials, yet only a handful show Christian influence. This suggests that Druids may have overseen the tradition, preserving it as part of their authority. Its archaic form supports this idea. Primitive Irish appears older than the spoken language of its time. Inscriptions, such as that commemorating Mac Caerthin, who died in 446, retain forms that had already vanished from everyday speech. Old Irish, seen in manuscripts from the 6th century onward, had advanced far closer to the modern language, even reintroducing the P sound. Thus, Ogham may represent a sacred, deliberately conservative register of the Celtic world, preserved by Druids long after it ceased to be spoken by the wider population. Ogham inscriptions in Britain are a clear marker of Irish settlement. The densest concentration is found in defied, southwest Wales, but examples also occur in Devon, Cornwall, northwest Wales, parts of Scotland, and on the Isle of Man, where 6 Ogham stones have been discovered. Over time, Manx Gaelic, a descendant of Old Irish, replaced the earlier Brittonic language of the island. In Roman times, the people of southwest Wales were known as the Demetae, and their territory of Demetia eventually became the medieval kingdom of Dyfed. The 6th century writer Gildas denounced Vortipor, tyrant of the Demetae, and a memorial stone inscribed in both Latin and Irish, thought to belong to this Vortipor, supports the later Irish tradition that settlers from the Daci established a dynasty there. The Daci, originally a term for vassal peoples, had by the 8th century become an established group in southeast Ireland, forming the sub-kingdom of Daci Muman. An Irish epic recounts the exile of the Daci from Tara, including the tale of Eochaid's son of Artchorp, who is said to have founded a line of kings in Demetia. This pedigree has striking parallels with Welsh royal genealogies. In both Irish and Welsh versions, a figure named Tryphon, or Tryphon, appears as the ancestor of Vortipor. The Welsh account links him to Magnus Maximus, a Roman general of Galician origin who seized imperial power in 383, but was killed 5 years later. His role as a supposed ancestor of several Welsh dynasties may reflect later genealogical constructions tracing local rulers back to an imperial overlord. The Irish presence in southwest Wales may have begun with bands of warriors recruited by Roman authorities in the late 4th century to guard the coast against raids. If so, Tryphon would have been the first of these Irish protectors, with the title later passing to Vortipor. Another Irish group, the Uí Liatháin of East Cork, also established themselves in South Wales and Cornwall. Medieval tradition records that the sons of Liatháin held lands in the territory of the Demetae, as well as in Gower and Kidwelly. In the same period, Christianity was spreading rapidly through Ireland, and the figure most associated with this movement is St. Patrick. His confession, written late in life and carefully preserved, offers a vivid self-portrait of a man who believed he was called by divine visions to bring the faith to Ireland. Having once been enslaved there, Patrick returned after training for the ministry in Britain, determined to convert the Irish. Over the centuries, his reputation grew so great that he became the patron saint of Ireland, with his feast day celebrated around the world. By contrast, Palladius, who was actually the first bishop sent to Ireland in 431, has been overshadowed by Patrick. Originating from Auxerre in Gaul, he likely belonged to the aristocratic Palladi family. His mission seems to have been aimed at supporting existing Christian communities rather than mass conversion. Two other bishops, Auxilius and Secundinus, remembered later as Patrick's companions, were probably linked to Palladius instead. Their legacy remains in Irish place names such as Killashie, the cell of Auxilius, in County Kildare, and Dunshaughlin, the fort of Secundinus, in County Meath, both located in the heart of Eastern Ireland. In Muirchew's Life of St. Patrick, the saint's mission is linked to the northeast of Ireland rather than the center. This suggests that his home, from which he had been taken, was likely located somewhere in the north of former Roman Britain. In Patrick's own confession, preserved in later manuscripts, his birthplace appears as Banavem Taburnii, a name that makes little sense as a Romano-British location. Since Latin writing of the time often lacked word breaks, a more logical reading would be Banaventa Burnier. One Banaventa was known in Northamptonshire, but this cannot have been Patrick's birthplace, as Muirchew places it near the Irish Sea. The added element Bernier or Bernier may have been meant to distinguish this otherwise unknown location. The exact site remains a mystery, and even Patrick's dates are uncertain. The Annals of Ulster record 4 possible dates for his death, but the year 493 is the most plausible, since Patrick's disciple Mochta, who established a monastery at Louth, died in 535. Patrick and Mochta were not the only Britons to arrive in northeast Ireland voluntarily. Irish records mention groups of Britons causing unrest in the region. One entry tells of the killing of Colman Moore, son of Dearmaid, in his chariot in 552 by Dubshlat ua Trena, described as one of the Cruithni. The name Croithni, or Crothin, is the Irish version of the Welsh word Pryden, meaning Britons. This itself reflects an older form, Prytani, literally figured people, commonly understood as tattooed folk. Ancient Greek travelers borrowed this name, rendering it into Greek and later Latin as Britanni. From this came the familiar island name Britannia, which was extended to cover Ireland and surrounding islands for convenience. The Cruithin arrivals in Ireland appear not to have had distinct tribal names, unlike groups such as the Brigantes. This marks them as part of the social transformations taking place after 400, when traditional tribal structures were dissolving. Earlier memorial stones in Ireland often recorded tribal affiliations, but by the mid-6th century, new dynasties were emerging instead, reshaping political life. Among these were the Dal Naraidi of southern Antrim and their branch, the Uí Eishach Coba. Both dynastic names are derived from personal ancestors, such as Echu of Coba. The region of Mag Koba, later known as Iveag in County Down, became their base. A record of Eochu's death in 553 identifies him retrospectively as the forefather of this line. Though genealogical claims tying him to older rulers of Ulaid are doubtful, the Dal Naraidi in later centuries abandoned the foreign-sounding label Cruthin, instead claiming descent from the Ulaid to legitimize their position. The annals preserve the names of successive chiefs of the Ui Achach Koba, and over time, hereditary surnames emerged from this lineage. One Aongus gave his descendants the name Macongusa, later anglicized as Maguinness. This family eventually rose as Lords of Ivia in the 12th century, displacing another branch of kin. Interestingly, modern DNA evidence suggests that some men with this surname carry markers traceable to British origins, supporting the tradition that the Cruthin arrived from across the sea. Because these newcomers reached Ireland after the Roman era, their absence from Ptolemy's 2nd century map is not surprising. But we should not assume that every group omitted from that map represents later arrivals. The Romans had little reason to chart Ireland carefully, and many dynasties that later gained prominence had not yet formed in Ptolemy's day. With the rise of ruling families such as the Ui Neil in the north and the Eoganachta in Munster, Ireland experienced not only political change, but also linguistic transformation. As Christianity displaced Druidic authority, primitive Irish as a sacred language gave way to Latin, which was also used to fashion a new written Irish. This became Old Irish, taught in monastic schools alongside Latin. It reflected the everyday speech of the people rather than the archaic language preserved by Druids. During this period, the ethnonym Fani came into use, designating rulers of Connaught and the Ui Neil, in contrast to Ulsterman and Leinster dynasties. The 7th century Battle of Moira in County Down, where the Ui Neil triumphed over Ulster power, was remembered as a turning point in Irish history. A later tradition even claimed that this battle inspired the writing of the earliest Irish grammar by Ken Félad MacAilil, a learned member of the Sinel Neogain, after he recovered from wounds there. His writings in Gaelic, composed in Derilurin, helped to create the first vernacular literature in Europe, securing a legacy for Old Irish as both a literary and scholarly language. Gildas railed bitterly against the disastrous decision of Vortigern and his council to invite Saxon mercenaries into Britain, comparing them to wolves let loose in a sheepfold. To him, nothing had been more destructive to the island. The Gallic Chronicle also reports Saxon devastation in Britain as early as 408, so the danger of relying on them should have been obvious. According to Gildas, these hired warriors soon turned against their employers, complaining of poor payment and calling in reinforcements from overseas, which marked the beginning of their foothold in Britain. Bede, writing later from Jarrow, provided more detail, naming the newcomers as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Being of Anglian descent himself, he gave pride of place to the Angles in his History of the English People, which helped secure the lasting name of England. The area most deeply Romanized, the fertile and urbanized South, was also the region that rapidly shifted to Anglo-Saxon control. Towns were deserted, and Latin speech was gradually replaced by the dialects that evolved into English. Some of the Romano-British population may have been killed, others absorbed, and some fled westward or across the sea. The survival of Celtic languages in upland regions with a distinct Latin-influenced accent suggests that many Romance speakers joined the native populations of the mountains. Gildas himself described a miserable remnant of Britain's fleeing famine, slavery, or exile. By 441, observers on the continent believed that the Saxons controlled the British provinces, though in reality, Welsh kingdoms, the southwest, and the Old North remained under British rulers for generations. As Anglo-Saxons expanded north and west after 550, long-standing intermarriage blurred lines between peoples. Early rulers of the which bore Germanic names but remained Christian, probably influenced by the Old British Church. The founder of Wessex, Celtic, carried a name resembling the British Caraticos. Laws from the reign of Aine of Wessex even acknowledged Welsh subjects within his realm, albeit at lower status. In the far southwest, Saxon advances were so gradual that Cornish retained their Brittonic tongue for centuries afterward. In many ways, the Anglo-Saxon invasions shaped Wales as a distinct country. Previously part of a wider Roman Britannia, Wales gained its separate identity once the lowlands were lost. The Welsh term Cymri, meaning people of the same land, first appeared in the 7th century, while the Anglo-Saxons branded them Wyalas, meaning foreigners. The construction of Offa's Dyke in the 8th century formalized the divide and left a border that still exists. Medieval Wales was fractured into competing kingdoms, but many of them traced their roots back to Romano-British civitates. Dyfed continued from Demetia, while Gwent carried on the legacy of the Silura, even retaining trade links with Byzantium. Powys, by contrast, formed only under pressure from advancing Angles. In the north, Gwynedd flourished thanks to the fertile Isle of Anglesey and the natural defenses of Snowdonia. Its origins lay in the Roman period, with inscriptions from around 500 showing a continuity of citizenship and Roman-style administration. The very name Gwynedd may derive from an old Brittonic root meaning kindred, much like the Breton Gwynedd for Vaughan, rather than from Irish intrusions. Nonetheless, Irish settlement left traces, such as the name of the Lun Peninsula from the Legan people. Anglesey became the seat of kings, and rulers like Maelgwyn were celebrated as lords of the island. Later dynasties linked themselves to Cunedda, said to have come south from the Gododin to drive out the Irish. Whether or not he personally made the journey, memory of his name reached Wales, most likely preserved by his descendants. After the Roman withdrawal, the territory of the Dumnoni, with its center at Isca, modern Exeter, became the Kingdom of Dumnonia. This realm remained British long after southeastern Britain fell under Anglo-Saxon control. In the mid-6th century, Gildas denounced its king Constantine in scathing terms, calling him the tyrant whelp of a filthy lioness. Over a century later, Aldhelm of Malmesbury wrote to King Geraint of Dumnonia, urging him to conform to Roman church customs. By the early 8th century, the rulers of Wessex had pressed into the region, shrinking Dumnonia into what became known as Cernau, or Cornwall, a name derived from the Celtic root corn, horn, describing the peninsula, combined with the Anglo-Saxon word wall for Britons. Dumnonia had earlier absorbed Irish settlers, which may have sparked the wider movement of Britons into Armorica in Gaul. This migration grew stronger as Saxon pressure increased, giving rise to the region's new identity as Brittany. Many settlers came from southwestern Britain, as reflected in Breton kingdoms like Dumnonia and Cernef. Churches named after their local saints remain as tangible evidence of this migration. Some figures, such as Samson and Petroc, were revered in both Cornwall and Brittany, but most were honored in one region only. Petroc became the chief Cornish saint, associated with Padstow and later Bodmin, and his cult spread across the Channel into Brittany. The life of Saint Samson of Dol describes him as Welsh-born, later moving through Cornwall to Brittany, where he founded Dol Monastery and attended the Council of Paris in 562. Another Brittonic settlement arose in Galicia, the Roman province covering modern Galicia, Asturias, Leon, and northern Portugal. There, a diocese called Britannia was established by 572, likely centered at Santa Maria de Bretonia near Mondoñedo. Its parishes stretched north to the sea and east into Asturias, evidence of a significant British migration. Centuries later, the Declaration of Arbroath, 1320, claimed that the Scots had driven out Britons and destroyed the Picts to justify Scottish independence. While wholesale extermination is implausible, it is true that the Picts ceased to exist as a distinct people after 900. Older theories spoke of a massive Irish invasion, but archaeological evidence shows continuity rather than a sudden cultural break. Some scholars propose that Western Scotland simply retained older Gaelic traditions, though the fact that Scottish Gaelic descends from Old Irish suggests deep connections with Ireland. Geography helps explain this link. The Kintyre Peninsula reaches toward northeastern Ireland, and the surrounding islands fostered constant contact through trade, marriage, and alliances. By the 8th century, Bede recorded that the Irish, under a leader named Ruda, settled in northern Britain, forming the kingdom of Dal Riata. This realm spanned parts of both Scotland and Ireland, binding several kindreds together under a shared Gaelic identity. Genealogies tied these clans to legendary Irish ancestors, though their histories reveal a mix of Pictish, Irish, and local roots. The Picts themselves promoted a tale that they secured Irish wives on the condition that their kings be chosen through the female line, a story later used to legitimize rulers with Pictish mothers. Kenneth MacAlpin, long hailed as the conqueror of the Picts, now appears to have been partly Pictish himself. Rather than eradicating the Picts, he united their territory with Dal Riata, and under his descendants the new kingdom of Alba took shape. The Gaelic language gained dominance at court, helped by close Irish royal connections. Instead of a sudden invasion, Gaelicization in Scotland looks more like a slow, interwoven process of migration, politics, religion, and cultural exchange. St. Columba, arriving in 563, symbolized this movement, founding the monastery at Iona and helping complete the Christianization of the Picts. With him came Irish art and scholarship, carrying forward the Latin-inspired designs that had flourished in Ireland. These artistic traditions culminated in masterpieces like the Book of Kells, with its breathtaking illuminated letters and intricate animal and plant motifs, a symbol of the fusion of faith and artistry in the Gaelic world. Great nations, those that have made their mark in history, can be compared to great rivers. To understand them fully, one must trace them back to their origins. By that measure, the Celtai, more commonly known as the Gauls, deserve recognition for their numbers, their valor, and their deep antiquity. In Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, some communities still speak Celtic languages, passed down through countless generations. Yet their numbers diminish steadily. English and French have nearly erased the tongues that survived into the medieval era. On the continent, Celtic languages were lost to Latin during the time of the Roman Empire, giving rise to Romance languages such as French and Spanish. Only in Brittany, where Britons from across the Channel settled after Rome's fall, did a Celtic language return and take root. One Celtic language, Cumbric, spoken in the Old North, disappeared so long ago that few recall its existence. It was replaced by English, which evolved into Scots in the lowlands. Cornish died out in the 19th century, while the last native speaker of Manx, Ned Madrill, passed away in 1974. Today, of the living Celtic tongues, Welsh is the strongest, though still classed as vulnerable. Irish and Scottish Gaelic are in greater danger, and Breton is considered severely endangered. At the dawn of the 20th century, Breton was spoken by nearly 2 million people. Now fewer than 250,000 remain. Its survival is remarkable, given that Breton was never a language of power. Latin served the church, French the nobility, while Breton was confined to the illiterate majority. The French Revolution sought to eliminate such regional languages, and even now, Breton has no official recognition. Irish, in contrast, is the national language of the Republic of Ireland, yet its decline as a community tongue mirrors that of Breton. It survives primarily in the Gaeltacht regions of the West. In Scotland, Gaelic is strongest in the Outer Hebrides. In Wales, the number of speakers dropped drastically over the 20th century, though census data in 2001 showed a small recovery thanks to its introduction in schools. Still, the fall in Welsh-speaking households remains troubling. Population movement has also shaped the fate of these languages. Viking settlement left Norse speech in Orkney, Shetland, and Caithness, a language known as Norn, which lasted until Scots gradually replaced it by the 14th century. The Normans, after conquering England, left little lasting linguistic mark there beyond vocabulary, but their expansion into Wales and Ireland began the process of shifting those regions towards English. In southern Pembrokeshire, Anglo-Norman settlement produced an area long known as Little England beyond Wales, a cultural and linguistic frontier that persists to this day. In 1167, Dermot MacMurrough, the deposed king of Leinster, sought foreign aid to regain his throne, turning to Anglo-Norman lords in Wales. With Henry II's consent, Richard Fitzgilbert, Earl of Pembroke, provided troops in exchange for Dermot's daughter and succession rights. Their victory in 1170 brought Dermot brief restoration, but his death the following year opened the way for Henry II to assert control. This marked the beginning of centuries of English involvement in Ireland. English colonization reduced the proportion of Celtic speakers in Cornwall, Wales, and Ireland. Elizabeth I encouraged new settlements in Ireland, and James I advanced the Ulster Plantation, bringing Scottish lowlanders and their Scots tongue. At the same time, many Celtic speakers left their homelands, drawn to opportunities in Paris, London, and the industrial cities of England. Later, migration carried them further, to the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand. Rarely did these emigrants maintain Celtic-speaking colonies, though the Welsh in Patagonia and Gaelic communities in Canada stand as exceptions. Over time, intermarriage with English speakers furthered the dominance of English, as households often passed the language to the next generation. Over the centuries, deliberate efforts were made by rulers and institutions to weaken or suppress the Celtic languages within the British Isles. Yet the irony is that such suppression may not even have been necessary. The natural forces of time, population size, and social change were already working in favor of English dominance. When two languages coexist for long periods, bilingualism often develops, and when one group is far larger than the other, the smaller group is more likely to abandon its tongue. This is the most common route by which minority languages die out. By the early 19th century, English speakers already formed the overwhelming majority. The first census of 1801 showed England with over 8 million people, compared to only 1.5 million in Scotland and 500,000 in Wales. Agricultural productivity in the fertile lowlands sustained larger populations than the dramatic landscapes of the highlands ever could. London dominated trade, politics, law, and education. Knowledge of English became essential for advancement in business, learning, or public life. Such conditions made the decline of smaller languages inevitable. This helps explain why even modern revival efforts often achieve only partial success. Irish has been taught in schools for generations, yet few households speak it daily. Cornish enthusiasts have revived their ancestral tongue, but English remains the language of everyday necessity. With English now the global lingua franca, only extraordinary commitment can preserve the living Celtic languages. The dominance of English sparked, in turn, a proud revival of Celtic identity. First, however, there had to be recognition that Welsh, Irish, Gaelic, Cornish, and Breton belonged to the same family. Renaissance scholars, revisiting classical sources, realized that the Gauls and the ancient Britons spoke closely related tongues. Thinkers such as George Buchanan in Scotland and William Camden in England challenged medieval fables about Britain's origins and instead traced linguistic and cultural links with Gaul. Their scholarship established the idea that the British Isles belonged within the wider Celtic world. Later, Paul-Yves Pézeran in France and Edward Lloyd in Oxford laid further foundations by studying living Celtic languages and comparing them with ancient sources. By the early 18th century, the concept of a Celtic language family had taken shape, with a distinctly romantic appeal. Here were linguistic relics of Europe's past, preserved at the far edge of the continent. This new pride in Celtic heritage spilled into art, literature, and politics. In the 18th century, Thomas Gray's poem *The Bard* lamented the destruction of Welsh poetic tradition under Edward I, capturing the sense of cultural loss to advancing English rule. Soon, travel to the Highlands and Wales became fashionable among English gentry, while the Victorians embraced Celtic art alongside Gothic revival and, later, Art Nouveau. Meanwhile, Celtic societies were founded to protect and promote heritage. The Simradorian Society in London in 1751, followed by the Gwenedigian Society in 1770. The ancient tradition of the Eisteddfod, festivals of poetry and music, was revived, leading eventually to the National Eisteddfod of Wales, which from 1937 officially embraced Welsh as its language. This Welsh model inspired similar movements across the Celtic world. Festivals in Ireland, Scotland, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Brittany sought to preserve their own languages and cultures. A pan-Celtic spirit found expression in gatherings such as the Inter-Celtic Festival at Lorient in Brittany, celebrating the 6 Celtic nations. In Ireland, the Gaelic League, founded in 1893 by historian and activist Eowyn MacNeill, aimed to preserve language and culture as part of a broader push toward national independence. MacNeill himself became a key political figure, founding the Irish Volunteers and, despite opposing outright rebellion, being imprisoned after the Easter Rising. His later role in the Free State government reflected the intertwining of cultural revival with political struggle. Thus, the history of Celtic languages in the modern age is one of resistance and reinvention. Though outnumbered and marginalized, these tongues became emblems of identity, rallying points for communities determined not to let them vanish without a fight. As Celtic identity became a rallying point in modern politics, governments began to grow uneasy. In the 20th century, the authority of nation-states faced challenges both from those pushing for local autonomy and from broader projects of integration. The determination of Irish nationalists to break away from Britain was an example of a minority seeking to form a majority within its own independent state. At the same time, efforts to build federal structures in Europe, particularly after the devastation of two world wars, were driven by the desire for lasting peace and economic strength against the rival powers of the United States and the Soviet Union. The European Coal and Steel Community of 1951 and the European Economic Community of 1957 embodied that vision of unity, while Britain, Ireland, and Denmark joined the project in 1973. Yet suspicion of Brussels and fear of eroded sovereignty quickly became recurring themes in British politics. Meanwhile, devolutionist pressures grew within the British Isles. In Wales and Scotland, nationalist parties won their first parliamentary representation in the 1960s. And in Northern Ireland, the Provisional IRA waged a violent campaign for union with the Republic until the late 1990s. In this context, cultural projects could take on political overtones. The I Celti exhibition in Venice in 1991, created by French and Italian cultural institutions, presented the Celts as a shared European heritage, a decentralized but interconnected society. Its timing, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, suggested an optimistic vision of Europe's unity rooted in cultural exchange rather than imperial conquest. For some in Britain, however, this seemed politically provocative. Elsewhere, Celtic heritage was used for very different ideological ends. Under General Franco in Spain, emphasis on Celtic roots was meant to highlight European links and distance the country from its historic connections with North Africa. Yet Franco's regime also suppressed non-Castilian languages and imposed rigid national homogeneity. The malleability of the Celts as a concept, capable of supporting federalist dreams in one place and authoritarian nationalism in another, illustrated how archaeology could become uncomfortably politicized. What is clear is that the ancient Celts themselves never formed a united federation. Their political life was tribal, and collective names were usually applied only by outsiders. The term Germani, for example, began as the name of a single tribe, later applied by the Romans to many groups who then adopted it themselves. The Celts of Britain, speaking mutually intelligible dialects, rarely needed a wider label until they encountered outsiders. In Gaul, Greek writers applied Keltoi as a broad designation, but in Britain, collective names tended to be geographical, such as Albion or Prytani. Greek and Roman writers were unreliable when tracing origins. Just as Italic is a modern label for languages like Latin, Umbrian, and Oscan, the idea of a Celtic family of languages and peoples was a product of modern scholarship. It took the work of linguists comparing inscriptions and of archaeologists uncovering pre-Roman Europe to make those connections. By the late 20th century, many scholars embraced Celto-skepticism, preferring not to use the term Celt at all for the peoples of Britain and Ireland. This fit within a broader rejection of invasionist models, reflecting a post-colonial reluctance to see history as a series of conquests. Instead, scholars emphasized the flow of ideas and styles without major population movements. Yet in recent years, the debate has shifted again. New research in genetics has revealed far more complex patterns of human mobility than earlier models allowed. It is now possible to test theories about migrations and relationships between ancient populations with evidence that goes beyond texts or material culture. The story of the Celts, once distorted by politics and ideology, can now be revisited with fresh tools that illuminate how people, languages, and identities truly moved across Europe. The most striking breakthroughs in recent years have come from the study of ancient DNA. What emerges is a narrative that reaches beyond Celtic origins to the beginnings of the entire Indo-European language family. Genetic evidence suggests that the European population was profoundly reshaped in the Copper Age by migrations from the steppe, long considered the likely homeland of Indo-European tongues. This explains connections between the ancestors of Siberian hunters and modern speakers of Celtic languages. Yet each new discovery generates fresh questions. That the insular Celts shared ancestry with their continental counterparts is now clear, but many details remain to be tested and refined as research progresses. The survival of Celtic languages in the present cannot be assumed, though there are encouraging signs. In Wales, bilingual road signs are commonplace, while in Scotland, the policy began in Gaelic-speaking regions and continues to expand. In Ireland, signs are bilingual, except in Gaeltacht areas, where Irish alone is used. To ensure that languages live, they must be spoken and heard daily. Broadcasting in Welsh, Gaelic, and Irish has played a vital part, but perhaps most significant has been the growth of primary schools teaching entirely in Celtic languages, not only in Wales, Ireland, and Brittany, but also on the Isle of Man. Such immersion produces confident new speakers. Political devolution in the 1990s gave Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland assemblies with powers to support and promote their native languages, strengthening hopes for their future. It is clear that modern Celtic speakers are not relics of the past. These languages, with their ancient roots, have never stood still, but evolved continuously, just as material culture has always adapted to new challenges and influences. Cultures, like living organisms, mutate and change as they interact, migrate, or innovate. Even groups with shared origins quickly diverge when shaped by different circumstances. Today, the Bretons, Cornish, Irish, Manx, Scots, and Welsh maintain their distinct identities, each with its own trajectory and, in some cases, its own genetic patterns. For example, genetic studies show that modern Cornish people form a cluster distinct from that of the Welsh. The broader picture of humanity is one of both continuity and transformation. Life for a Celt today is utterly unlike that of an ancestor 4,000 years ago, yet the thread of identity, reshaped through time, still connects them. A song once carried only as far as the human voice could reach. Now it can travel across the entire world.